Thomas Kincaid's hands shook as he counted 85 crumpled bills, the absolute limit of his life. The storage auction crowd sneered at the gaunt man in the wheelchair, dismissively turning their backs on the junk in Unit 247. But Duke, his German shepherd, stood frozen. The dog's whining turned into a desperate, frantic clawing at the base of an old military trunk in the corner. "Duke, stop, it's empty," Tom rasped, his lungs burning from the stage 3 cancer. But Duke didn't stop. He wasn't scratching the surface, he was prying at the seams. Tom leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw what the dog had found. The wooden panels at the bottom were slightly recessed, the grain running the wrong way. It wasn't a trunk floor at all, it was a concealment. A hidden compartment that had stayed silent for 40 years. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Atmospheric expansion. The air in the storage facility wasn't just cold, it was indifferent. It smelled of motor oil, damp cardboard, and the metallic tang of a life being liquidated. Tom felt the chill in the phantom space where his legs used to work, a dull, rhythmic throb that matched the ticking clock of his diagnosis. He sat hunched in his worn denim jacket, his frame gaunt from chemotherapy, his gray stubble hiding a jawline that still held the ghost of military discipline. Pressed against his wheel was Duke. The German shepherd was a living anchor, his amber eyes reflecting a quiet intelligence that seemed to understand the math of Tom's bank account better than Tom did. Duke didn't just see a sick man. He saw a commander who was retreating, and he refused to let the line break. Tom's gaze drifted to a pile of rusted scrap, but he wasn't seeing the unit. A sudden, sharp hiss from a nearby forklift's hydraulic line sent him spiraling back. He wasn't in a storage facility anymore. He was back in the dry, choking dust of Afghanistan. He saw the shimmering heat on the road, the hum of the convoy, and then the world-ending snap of the IED. He remembered the smell of burnt rubber and the sterile, blinding white of the military hospital that followed. But it wasn't the explosion that haunted him. It was the silence that followed, the bureaucratic paper shuffling of a system that decided a paralyzed sergeant was a completed file. He remembered the cold eyes of the discharge officer telling him the funding wasn't there for the experimental recovery he'd been promised. He had lost his legs to an enemy bomb, but he had lost his soul to a signature on a government form. A low, insistent whine pulled Tom back to the gray reality of the auction. Duke's nose was cold against his hand. "I'm here, boy," Tom whispered, his voice like gravel. He looked at the eviction notice tucked into the side of his wheelchair. The subsidized housing authorities weren't unkind, just efficient. He had 30 days to disappear. Most shelters didn't take aggressive breeds, like German shepherds, and Tom would rather sleep in the dirt than breathe a minute of air without Duke. With the sun dipping low and the shadows of the storage lockers stretching out like prison bars, Tom looked at the trunk Duke had uncovered. This wasn't just a gamble on antiques anymore. In the way Duke's ears were pinned back, in the way the dog refused to leave that specific spot of wood, Tom felt a familiar, dormant spark. It was the feeling of a mission. He reached down, his fingers brushing the hidden latch of the false floor. He wasn't just looking for money for treatment. He was looking for a reason to fight back against a world that had written him off. The radiator in apartment 4B didn't hiss so much as it wheezed, a wet, metallic rattle that sounded uncomfortably like the man sitting across from it. Thomas Kincaid leaned forward in his wheelchair, the movement stiff and calculated, as if his spine were made of rusted rebar. He reached out a hand that had once been steady enough to lead a long-range reconnaissance platoon through the Hindu Kush, but now it trembled with a fine, persistent palsy. He adjusted the dial on the heater, but it did nothing to cut the damp chill clinging to the room. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was in his bones, a deep, marrow-deep frost that had settled in when the doctors at the VA hospital had stopped talking about recovery and started using words like palliative and comfort measures. Beside him, Duke, a German shepherd whose coat was the color of a winter forest at dusk, let out a soft, low-frequency huff. The dog didn't move from his position, his chin resting heavily on Tom's left thigh, which had no feeling left in it. Duke was more than a service dog. He was a living barometer. He felt the spikes in Tom's cortisol, the dip in his oxygen, and the heavy, suffocating blanket of despair that had become the apartment's primary decor. Tom's gaze drifted to the coffee table, a scarred piece of particle board held up by stacks of old National Geographics. Atop it lay a manila folder, its edges frayed from being opened and closed 100 times. Inside was the math of his death. Stage 3 adenocarcinoma. It was an aggressive, silent invader that had hitched a ride in his lungs and was now colonizing his lymph nodes with the efficiency of a scorched earth campaign. Dr. Aris, a man whose kindness felt like a bandage on a gunshot wound, had been blunt during their last meeting. The experimental immunotherapy protocol has a high success rate, Thomas, Aris had said, his voice echoing in the sterile, white-tiled room. But the private pharmaceutical wing won't cover it because of the pre-existing spinal trauma from your service. The cost, out of pocket, is $125,000 for the initial cycle. $125,000. To Tom, it might as well have been $1 billion. He lived on a disability pension that was eroded every month by the rising cost of generic pain meds and the basic overhead of existing. He looked at the other paper tucked into the folder, the one with the bold, red letterhead from the Municipal Housing Authority. It was an eviction notice. 30 days. Apparently, the subsidized veteran housing project was being sold to a developer who saw more value in luxury microlofts than in a warehouse for broken soldiers. 30 days to vacate, Tom whispered, his voice a dry rasp. They're giving us a month to disappear, Duke. Duke looked up, his amber eyes wide and liquid with an empathy that felt almost painful. The dog shifted, pressing closer, the warmth of his body the only thing keeping Tom from shattering into 1,000 frozen pieces. Tom reached down, burying his fingers in the thick fur behind Duke's ears. This was the man he was now, a 58-year-old ghost in a chair, waiting for the clock to run out in a room that smelled like stale soup and impending defeat. He closed his eyes and for a moment the sound of the radiator transformed. The wet hiss became the sound of sand hitting a windshield. The smell of the apartment was replaced by the pungent, eye-watering scent of diesel fuel and parched earth. Afghanistan 2011. The Kunar province. He could feel the weight of the interceptor vest, the reassuring bulk of his M4. He was Sergeant First Class Kincaid then, a man who moved with the silent lethargy of a mountain lion. He remembered the hum of the Humvee, the way the heat seemed to vibrate off the hood. He remembered Miller in the driver's seat, whistling some country song, and Henderson in the back, complaining about the MREs. "Check the ridge, Sarge," Henderson had said. Tom had turned his head, his eyes scanning the shale slopes for the glint of a lens or the unnatural silhouette of a rifle barrel. He was a master of the terrain, a man who could read a landscape like a map of a human soul. He felt the vehicle shift as it hit a dip in the goat path they were using as a road. Then came the snap. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't an explosion. It was a sharp, pressurized crack, the sound of the world breaking in half. A flash of white light so intense it felt like it was burning the memories right out of his brain. Then the weight. It felt like the entire mountain had decided to sit on his chest. He tried to move his legs to kick his way out of the crumpled metal, but there was nothing. No pain. No sensation. Just a terrifying, bottomless void where his lower body used to be. He remembered the dust, thick and tasting of copper. He remembered looking through the shattered glass and seeing the sky, a cruel, perfect blue. And he remembered the silence. Miller wasn't whistling anymore. Henderson wasn't complaining. There was only the sound of his own breathing, ragged and panicked, and the distant, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the medevac blades that would eventually carry him away from the war and into a different kind of combat. One involving bureaucrats, insurance adjusters, and the slow, grinding machinery of a system that didn't know what to do with a soldier who had been returned in pieces. A sharp bark from Duke snapped him back to the present. Tom's eyes flew open, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was sweating despite the cold. "I'm okay, boy," he lied, his hand trembling as he wiped his brow. Just a memory." But it wasn't just a memory. It was the anchor. That moment on the road had been the start of a slow-motion fall that had lasted 14 years. The Army had given him medals, a "thank you for your service," and a medical discharge that felt like a pink slip. He had spent the first 5 years fighting for a chair that worked, the next 5 fighting for the benefits he'd been promised, and the last 4 watching his body betray him in new and inventive ways. The cancer was just the final insult, the closing argument in a case the world had built against him. He looked at the clock on the wall. 5:30. He didn't have much time. If he was going to make it to the Pine Valley storage facility, he had to move now. He had spent the last week scouring the online auction boards, looking for a Hail Mary. He had $85 left in his emergency jar, the money he had been saving for Duke's annual vet checkup. It was a gamble that felt like suicide, but sitting in this room waiting for the eviction crew felt like a slow-motion execution. "Let's go, Duke," Tom said, his jaw tightening with a ghost of the old military resolve. One last mission. The process of getting ready was a choreographed struggle. Every movement required a conscious exertion of will. He used a reaching tool to grab his boots, pulling them onto his unresponsive feet with a grimace. He threw on his old brown leather jacket, the one he bought right after the discharge, now cracked and stiff with age. He checked his bag, the flashlight, his multi-tool, a bottle of water, and the $85 folded neatly in his pocket. The van was a 2004 Econoline with a temperamental hydraulic lift that Tom had repaired himself more times than he could count. As he wheeled himself out into the pre-dawn gray of the city, the air bit at his face. The city felt predatory at this hour, the skyscrapers looming like monoliths, the streets slick with a greasy film of frost. Duke hopped into the passenger seat, his ears perked, his eyes scanning the shadows as Tom struggled with the lift. The machinery groaned, a high-pitched protest that echoed through the empty parking lot. Tom gritted his teeth, his muscles burning as he hauled himself into the driver's seat. The drive to Pine Valley took 40 minutes. He drove with a cautious, practiced hand, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors. It was a habit he couldn't break, the tactical awareness of a man who spent his life expecting an ambush. He watched the other cars, noting the make and model, looking for anything that stayed in his wake too long. It was a useless skill for a dying man in a wheelchair, but it was all he had left of the person he used to be. Pine Valley Storage was a sprawling complex of corrugated metal and chain-link fences, sitting on the edge of the industrial district where the city began to fray into wasteland. The auction was already drawing a crowd. Tom saw the sharks, the professional flippers in their clean SUVs, carrying tablets and smelling of expensive coffee. They moved with a predatory grace, eyeing the units with the cold calculation of vultures circling a carcass. When Tom rolled his van into the lot and the lift began its slow, noisy descent, he felt their eyes. It wasn't pity. Pity required a level of connection. It was annoyance. He was an obstacle, a slow-moving complication in their fast-paced morning. He ignored them. He rolled toward the gathering crowd at the mouth of the facility, Duke walking in a perfect heel at his side. The dog's presence was a shield. Duke sensed the hostility in the air, the subtle sneers of the men in North Face jackets who whispered as Tom passed. Duke didn't growl, but his posture changed. His shoulders went broad, his gait became a steady, rhythmic march. He was a sentinel at the gates. "All right, listen up," the auctioneer shouted, a man with a voice like a gravel crusher. "We've got 12 units today. Terms are cash on the spot. You've got 30 seconds to look from the threshold. No entering the units. If you touch it, you bought it." The first few units were the usual fare. Water-damaged furniture, boxes of old clothes, the detritus of lives that had been interrupted by divorce, debt, or death. The sharks bid them up quickly, looking for the easy scores: electronics, tools, mid-century furniture. Tom stayed in the back, his eyes moving over the crowd and the facility. He wasn't looking for a score, he was looking for a sign. He felt a deep, hollow ache in his chest, not the cancer but the bitter realization of how far he had fallen. He was a man who had once been responsible for the lives of 20 soldiers, and now he was competing with bottom feeders for the right to dig through someone's trash. Unit 247, the auctioneer announced, moving down the long, echoing corridor. The heavy rolling door creaked upward, revealing a dark, cramped space. It was a small unit, 5 by 10, and it looked like a tomb. It was packed with old, heavy furniture, the kind made of dark, solid wood that had gone out of style decades ago. There were stacks of dusty paintings in ornate frames and several large, brass-cornered trunks that looked like they belonged on a 19th-century steamship. "Look at that junk," one of the pros muttered, checking his watch. "All that heavy oak. Costs more to haul it to the dump than it's worth." "And that smell," another added, wrinkling his nose. "Mothballs and damp. Pass." Tom rolled forward, stopping at the very edge of the threshold. He felt a strange vibration in his legs, not feeling exactly but a phantom hum. He looked at Duke. The dog had gone completely still. His ears were forward, his nose twitching with an intensity Tom hadn't seen in months. Duke wasn't just sniffing the air. He was tracking a scent, his body tensing as he stared into the back of the unit. Duke took a tentative step toward the opening, a low, urgent whine vibrating in his throat. "Duke, back," Tom whispered. But the dog didn't move. He stayed focused on a large, military-style trunk in the back corner, half hidden under a moth-eaten wool blanket. Tom looked at the unit again. To anyone else, it was a mess of outdated, heavy furniture and dust. But to Tom's trained eyes, there was something else. The way the items were packed wasn't random. It was organized. The heavy pieces were positioned to shield the smaller items in the back. It was a defensive perimeter. Someone had spent a lot of time making sure the things in this unit were protected, not just stored. Opening bid $50, the auctioneer yelled. Silence. The sharks were already looking toward the next door, disinterested in the heavy lifting required for Unit 247. 50? Do I hear 50? Tom felt the weight of the $85 in his pocket. It was his last line of defense. If he spent it and found nothing, he and Duke would be on the street in 30 days with no way back. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, uneven beat. 40? The auctioneer tried again, his voice echoing in the metallic hallway. Come on, there's a lot of wood in there. $30, Tom said, his voice surprisingly clear. A few of the pros turned, smirking. The vet wants the firewood, one whispered loud enough for Tom to hear. 30? I have 30. Do I hear 40? 40? A voice called out from the back. It was a young guy in a designer hoodie, probably looking for a cheap trunk to turn into a shabby chic coffee table. Tom felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt since the Cuner. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the unit, on the strange, insistent focus in Duke's posture. 50, Tom said. 60, the kid countered, his tone bored. Tom's grip on his wheelchair handles tightened. 70. The auctioneer pointed a finger at the kid. 70 is the bid. Do I hear 80? The kid looked at Tom, then at the dusty, moth-eaten unit and shrugged. All yours, old man. Have fun with the termites. 70 going once, twice. Sold to the gentleman in the chair for $70. Tom felt a sudden, cold wave of panic. He had just spent nearly all his remaining money on a room full of shadows. He rolled toward the clerk to pay, his mind racing. Was he crazy? Was he just a dying man having one last delusional moment of agency? As he handed over the crumpled bills, he felt a strange sense of finality. He had crossed the line of departure. There was no turning back now. He rolled back to Unit 247. The facility was quiet now as the crowd moved deeper into the complex. He stood at the entrance, the cool, stale air of the unit washing over him. Duke was already inside, his tail low, his body alert. The dog moved straight to the back, to the trunk under the blanket. Tom followed, his wheelchair crunching over the grid on the floor. The unit was even darker than it had appeared from the hallway. He pulled out his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust motes. The furniture was indeed heavy, but as the light hit the surface of a desk, Tom saw the craftsmanship. Hand-carved mahogany. Dovetail joints. This wasn't junk. But Duke wasn't interested in the desk. He was at the military trunk, his paws scratching tentatively at the brass corners. What is it, boy? Tom whispered. He reached out and pulled the wool blanket away. The trunk was massive, made of dark wood and reinforced with steel bands. It had a heavy, industrial-grade lock that had been snapped off, leaving the latch hanging. Tom grabbed the lid and heaved. It was incredibly heavy, the hinges screaming with a sound of long-neglected metal. He pushed the lid back, expecting to see more blankets or maybe some old uniforms. The trunk was empty. Tom felt his stomach drop. He stared into the hollow, velvet-lined interior. It was clean, devoid of even a speck of dust. He had spent his last dollars on a hollow box. Duke, we're done, Tom said, his voice cracking. It's empty. He turned his wheelchair to leave, the bitterness rising in his throat like bile. He had failed. One last mission, and he had walked straight into an ambush of his own making. But Duke didn't follow. The German shepherd stayed by the trunk, his whining growing louder, more insistent. He began to scratch at the floor of the trunk, his claws scraping against the wood with a frantic, desperate rhythm. Duke, leave it. Tom commanded, his voice sharp with frustration. Duke ignored him. He looked up at Tom, his eyes wide and frantic, then went back to scratching. He wasn't scratching the surface. He was prying his claws into a tiny, almost invisible gap between the bottom board and the side wall. Tom froze. He rolled back to the trunk, his pulse quickening. He shone the flashlight directly onto the spot where Duke was scratching. The bottom of the trunk sat nearly 4 inches above the floor level of the exterior. It looked like a solid piece of wood, but as Tom leaned in, he saw the grain. It didn't line up with the rest of the trunk. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and pressed his palm against the bottom panel. He pushed down hard, but nothing happened. He tried to pry it up with his nails, but it was flush. Then he remembered a trick an old EOD tech had shown him. He didn't push. He slid. Tom placed both hands on the wooden base and pushed toward the back of the trunk. With a low, wooden groan, the entire floor of the trunk shifted. It slid back an inch, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. The air that escaped from the gap smelled of old paper and something metallic, the smell of secrets kept in the dark for 40 years. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He reached into the opening and pulled the false floor completely away. Tucked into the shallow space were 3 items. First, a purple heart medal in a worn velvet presentation case, the purple ribbon faded but the gold heart still gleaming. Second, a small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and the pages yellowed with age. And third, a heavy metal lockbox with a 3-digit combination dial, sitting there in the dark like a silent, waiting bomb. Tom reached for the journal first, but as his fingers brushed the leather, he heard a sound from the hallway. A heavy, rhythmic footstep. "Hey, you still in here?" A voice boomed, one of the facility managers, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the unit floor. "Auction's over. You gotta clear out or start the paperwork." Tom instinctively pulled the journal toward him, hiding it in the shadows of his wheelchair. He felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt of fear, not for his safety but for the items. His military instincts, dormant for so long, were screaming at him. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a recovery. As the manager stepped into the light, his eyes narrowed at the open trunk. Tom felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. He realized in that moment that he wasn't just a sick man in a wheelchair anymore. He was holding something that someone had gone to great lengths to hide, something that felt far more dangerous than $85 worth of junk. The manager's eyes dropped to the floor of the trunk, then back to Tom's face. "What you got there, Sarge?" the man asked, his voice losing its professional edge and sharpening into something else. Something that felt very much like a threat. The Pine Valley storage facility sat like a rusted fortress on the bleeding edge of the city's industrial district, a place where the skyline traded glass and steel for corrugated metal and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. The morning air was a cruel, damp gray, the kind that didn't just chill the skin but seemed to seek out old injuries with surgical precision. For Thomas Kincaid, the cold was an interrogator, twisting the knife in his lower back and turning the phantom sensations in his legs into a dull, rhythmic ache. He sat in the driver's seat of his aging Econoline, his hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, watching the sharks gather near the main gate. They were a specific breed, these professional storage flippers. They arrived in clean, late-model pickup trucks and SUVs, clutching tablets and high-powered LED flashlights like they were going into a tactical breach. They moved with a predatory energy, laughing and swapping stories of big scores, while ignoring the gray-faced man struggling with the hydraulic lift at the back of a battered van. "Easy, Duke," Tom whispered as the lift began its slow, complaining descent. The metal groaned, a high-pitched scream of neglected machinery that drew a few disparaging glances from the crowd. Duke stood on the platform, his ears swiveled back, his body a silent, muscular weight beside Tom's chair. The German Shepherd didn't like the noise and he certainly didn't like the vibration of the lift, but he remained a statue. He was a service dog trained for the chaos of a battlefield, and a squeaky lift was nothing compared to the roar of a Chinook. Once the platform hit the cracked asphalt with a jarring thud, Tom wheeled himself off, the small front casters of his chair catching in a pothole. He lurched forward, his heart skipping a beat as he nearly tipped. "Hey, watch it, Pops. You're leaking oil or something," a man in a bright orange hunting jacket shouted, stepping aside with an exaggerated flourish. His buddies chuckled, short, sharp barks of laughter that felt like pebbles hitting a windshield. Tom didn't look up. He adjusted his grip on the rims of his wheels, his knuckles white against the cold metal. He had $85 in his pocket. It was his entire world. It was the difference between a roof over Duke's head and a cardboard box under the Monongahela Bridge. He felt the weight of it, the crumpled bills tucked into a small envelope, like a live grenade he was terrified to pull the pin on. The auctioneer, a man named Miller with a voice that sounded like it had been cured in cheap bourbon and cigarette smoke, stepped onto a plastic crate. "All right, listen up. You know the rules. Cash only. You buy the whole unit, you got 48 hours to clear it or I keep the deposit and the junk. No entering the unit during the preview. You stay behind the yellow line. If I see a foot cross that threshold, you're out. Let's go." The crowd surged forward, a wave of nylon jackets and work boots. Tom followed at the rear, the low-slung perspective of the wheelchair making the forest of legs seem impenetrable. He moved through the maze of metal corridors, the smell of motor oil and stagnant air growing thicker. They bypassed the first 3 units quickly. They were trash units, piles of plastic bags, broken particle board furniture, and the sad, damp remains of lives lived in a hurry. The sharks picked them apart with their eyes in seconds, moving on when they didn't see the glint of a tool chest or the familiar silhouette of a flat-screen TV box. Then they reached Unit 247. When the rolling door creaked upward, a heavy, mothball-scented silence spilled out. Unlike the chaotic piles in the other lockers, 247 was packed with a strange, disciplined precision. In the dim light, the shapes of heavy, dark furniture loomed, solid oak dressers, a roll-top desk that looked like it weighed 500 pounds, and stacks of oil paintings wrapped in yellowed newspaper. "Look at this graveyard," the man in the orange jacket scoffed, shining his light over the unit. "Old-growth oak. You'd need a crane to move that desk, and who wants it? It's out of style by 50 years. That's a backbreaker unit, boys. Move along." "Military surplus too," another added, pointing his beam at a stack of olive-drab footlockers near the front. "Probably full of moth-eaten wool blankets and rusted tent poles. Not worth the gas to haul it to the scrapyard." Tom rolled to the front of the line, his eyes narrowing. He didn't see junk. He saw the way the furniture was positioned. It wasn't just stored, it was bunkered. The heavy desk had been placed to shield the smaller trunks in the back, creating a narrow aisle that only a dog or a very small person could navigate. His military mind, the part of him that still thought in terms of sectors of fire and concealment, began to tingle. Duke, usually the picture of stoic indifference, suddenly went rigid. His nose twitched, a frantic, rhythmic movement. He took a step forward, his chest brushing the yellow line, and let out a sound, a low, vibrating thrum in his throat that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine. "Duke, stay," Tom murmured, but his own heart had started to accelerate. He looked at the paintings. The frames were ornate, heavy gold leaf that had tarnished to a deep bronze. Even through the dust and the grime, the brushwork visible on one exposed corner looked sophisticated, dark, moody landscapes that felt older than the facility itself. "Opening bid $50. Miller shouted, his eyes scanning the disinterested faces of the pros. "50 for the antique lot. Come on, look at that oak. That's real wood, not that Swedish plywood you guys buy." Silence. The Sharks were already looking down the hall toward Unit 248, which supposedly belonged to a local contractor who had gone bust. 40? Do I hear 40? Tom felt the envelope in his pocket. It felt hot. "Don't do it," his rational mind whispered. "That $85 is food. It's the vet bill. It's the only safety net you have left." 30? "Someone give me 30 just to open the door." $30, Tom said. The sound of his own voice surprised him. It was raspy, thin, but it held a note of authority that hadn't been there in years. The crowd turned. The man in the orange jacket smirked, his eyes trailing down to Tom's paralyzed legs. "The vet wants the firewood," the man chuckled. "Hey Pops, you got a ramp for that desk? Or you gonna use your service dog as a pack mule?" The laughter was louder this time. Tom felt the heat rise in his neck, a familiar, bitter shame. He had led men into fire, had held the line while the world exploded around him, and now he was a punchline for a guy who sold used lawnmowers on eBay. 30 is the bid. Miller shouted, ignoring the banter. "Do I hear 40? 40? Orange Jacket said, clearly just to be an asshole. He didn't want the unit. He wanted to see the man in the chair squirm. Tom didn't hesitate. 50. 60, the man countered instantly, leaning against the doorframe of the neighboring unit. Tom felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. He was at 60. If he went higher, he was gambling with the very air he breathed. He looked at Duke. The dog was staring into the back of the unit, his amber eyes fixed on a specific trunk, a massive, brass-bound military chest made of dark, heavy wood. Duke's tail gave one sharp, involuntary wag. 70, Tom said. The crowd went quiet. $70 for a backbreaker unit was madness. 75, the man in the orange jacket said, though his smirk was beginning to falter. He was reaching his limit for a joke. Tom closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He thought of the eviction notice. He thought of the $125,000 he didn't have. He thought of the way the world had spent the last 14 years telling him he was a completed file. $85, Tom said. The auctioneer paused. 85? That your final bid, sir? It's everything I have, Tom said, his voice level. The man in the orange jacket scoffed and waved a hand dismissively. All yours, Captain. Hope you like the smell of mothballs and failure. 85 going once, twice. Sold. To the man in the chair for $85. As the crowd moved on, the facility manager stepped forward, holding a clipboard. Tom handed over the envelope, his fingers trembling as he watched his last shred of security vanish into the manager's pocket. He was handed a heavy brass padlock and a receipt. He was alone now in the quiet of the corridor, the echoes of the auction fading away. He rolled into the threshold of Unit 247, the wheels of his chair crunching over the grit. Duke didn't wait for the command. He slipped inside, navigating the narrow gap between the oak furniture with the grace of a predator. The smell was overwhelming, a cocktail of ancient dust, damp wool, and something metallic like the scent of an old gun shop. Tom pulled a small LED flashlight from his pocket, the beam cutting a weak path through the gloom. He moved the stack of paintings first, carefully leaning them against the wall. They were heavier than they looked, the wood frame solid and cold. Then he reached the roll-top desk. It was a masterpiece of 19th century engineering, but it was empty, the drawers pulled out, the cubbyholes filled with nothing but dead spiders. Nothing, Tom whispered, his stomach doing a slow, sickening roll. God, I'm an idiot. But Duke wasn't at the desk. He was at the very back of the unit, standing over the large, brass-cornered military trunk. The dog was frantic now, his paws scratching at the concrete floor beneath the trunk, a low, urgent whining coming from deep in his chest. Duke, what is it? It's just an old box, boy. Tom wheeled himself closer, the space so tight he had to tuck his elbows in. He reached out and grabbed the lid of the trunk. It wasn't locked, but the hinges were seized with decades of rust. He heaved, his shoulder muscles screaming, until the lid finally gave way with a sound like a gunshot. The trunk was empty. Tom stared into the hollow, cedar-lined interior. He felt a wave of nausea so powerful he had to grip the sides of his wheelchair to keep from falling. $85. His last $85 for an empty box and some heavy furniture he couldn't even move. He felt the tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, not from physical pain, but from the sheer, crushing weight of his own desperation. I'm sorry, Duke, he rasped. I failed you. We're done. He turned to roll away, but Duke wouldn't move. The dog had wedged his nose into the corner of the trunk's interior, his tail whipping back and forth with violent intensity. He began to scratch at the floor of the trunk, his claws clicking against the wood. Duke, back. Tom commanded, his voice sharp with frustration. The dog ignored him. He barked, a single sharp explosion of sound that echoed through the metal locker. He looked at Tom, then back at the trunk floor, his ears pinned back in a gesture of absolute certainty. Tom froze. He looked at the trunk again. He noticed something he had missed in his panic. The interior of the trunk was only about 12 inches deep, but the exterior height was nearly 18 inches. He leaned over, his flashlight beam scanning the seams of the cedar lining. It sits too high, he whispered. He reached into the trunk, pressing his palms against the bottom. The wood felt solid, but as he applied pressure to the rear left corner, he felt a mechanical click. It was the sound of a spring-loaded latch, a sound he hadn't heard since he was clearing weapons in a dusty outpost. He pushed again, sliding his hands toward the center. The bottom panel didn't lift, it shifted. It slid back half an inch, revealing a hairline fracture in the wood. Tom hooked his fingernails into the gap and pulled. The false bottom came away with a soft, velvet-lined hiss. Tom's breath hitched. He wasn't looking at mothballs or wool blankets. Nestled in a custom-carved foam insert were three distinct objects. The first was a small velvet presentation case, the lid slightly ajar. Inside, the Purple Heart medal lay against a bed of faded white silk, the gold profile of Washington catching the LED light like a beacon. It was pristine, untouched by the dust of the unit. Beside it lay a journal. It was bound in thick, dark leather, sealed with a heavy wax stamp that bore the crest of a unit Tom didn't recognize. The leather was supple, as if it had been treated recently, and the pages were thick and yellowed at the edges. The third item was the most imposing, a small, matte black metal lockbox. It was heavy, made of reinforced steel, with a high-security 3-digit combination dial on the front. It looked modern, out of place among the 19th century antiques. A piece of cold, hard technology protecting a secret that had been buried in the dark for a generation. Tom reached out, his hand hovering over the journal. As his fingers brushed the cold leather, a sudden, sharp chill raced up his arm. Not the cold of the storage unit, but the cold of a man who realized he had just stepped onto a landmine he didn't know how to disarm. Duke let out a long, low whine, his head resting on the edge of the trunk as he stared at the lockbox. What did we find, Duke? Tom whispered, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. He picked up the Purple Heart. He turned it over, expecting to see a name, a date, a fragment of history. But the back of the metal was smooth, the metal cold and unyielding. As he reached for the journal, he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of a rolling door closing several units down. Then the sound of voices, low, urgent, and moving toward Unit 247. He's in here, A voice said, the tone devoid of the auctioneer's joviality or the shark's mockery. It was a flat, professional voice, the kind Tom had heard in briefing rooms and interrogation centers. Find the trunk. Do not let the man in the chair leave with it. Tom's blood turned to ice. He looked at the exit, the narrow corridor he had just rolled through. There was nowhere to hide and he was too slow to run. He looked back at the lockbox, his mind racing through tactical options that his broken body could no longer execute. He grabbed the journal and the lockbox, shoving them into the hidden pocket of his denim jacket, but the lockbox was too heavy, pulling the fabric taut. He heard the shadow fall across the threshold of the unit. Thomas Kincaid, the voice said, stepping into the dim light. I think you've bought something that doesn't belong to you. Tom looked up into the eyes of a man who didn't look like an auction flipper. He was tall, wearing a charcoal gray tactical jacket, his hands resting easily at his sides in a way that suggested he was mere seconds away from a draw. But it wasn't the man that made Tom's breath stop. It was the small silver pin on the man's lapel, the same crest he had just seen on the wax seal of the journal. The trunk stays, the man said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. And you're coming with us. Duke's hackles rose, a low, murderous growl vibrating through the floorboards, but the man didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small electronic device that began to emit a high-pitched, oscillating frequency. Duke whimpered, his head shaking as he collapsed to his knees, his specialized training struggling against a sound that felt like a needle in his brain. Duke? Tom shouted, reaching for the dog, but his wheelchair was kicked back with a sudden violent force, pinning him against the heavy oak desk. The man stepped into the unit, his eyes fixed on the false bottom of the trunk. You shouldn't have opened it, Thomas. You should have just let the cancer take you. Tom felt a sudden white-hot spark of the old Sergeant Kincaid flare in his chest. The man who didn't know how to quit, the man who had survived the cure when everyone else had died. Who the hell are you? Tom rasped, his hand gripping the heavy metal lockbox through his jacket. The man smiled, but there was no light in it. I'm the ghost of the mistake you just made. As the man reached for the lockbox, the lights in the corridor flickered and died, plunging the storage facility into a suffocating absolute darkness, broken only by the sound of a heavy metallic click, the sound of the lockbox in Tom's pocket beginning to hum. The return to apartment 4B was a slow-motion blur of agony and adrenaline. Every bump in the road during the 40-minute drive felt like a physical assault on Tom's spine, a reminder that his body was a failing vessel, held together by sheer willpower and the heavy-duty painkillers that were currently losing the battle against the fire in his lungs. By the time he maneuvered the Econoline's lift back onto the cracked asphalt of the housing project's parking lot, the sun was a bruised purple smear against the horizon. The city was tucking itself in, but for Tom, the day was only just beginning. Inside the apartment, the air felt even more stagnant than when he had left. It was a space that had shrunk to the dimensions of his survival. One room, dominated by the hospital bed he rarely slept in because the reclining chair offered better breathing, and cluttered with the high-tech detritus of a terminal life. An oxygen concentrator sat in the corner, its rhythmic hiss-thump the only heartbeat the room had. Boxes of nitrile gloves, stacks of gauze, and a forest of amber pill bottles occupied the surfaces where photos of a younger, standing Tom should have been. Duke didn't wait for a command. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the dog did a quick, tactical sweep of the small space, checking the bathroom, the kitchenette, and the shadow behind the recliner, before collapsing near the door. He was exhausted, his chest heaving as he rested his chin on his paws, but his ears remained forward. He was on guard, his amber eyes tracking Tom as he wheeled himself to the small, scarred kitchen table. Tom placed the items from the storage unit onto the table with the care one might afford a live explosive. The Purple Heart, the leather journal, and the matte black lockbox. Against the backdrop of his stained coffee mug and a pile of unopened medical bills, they looked like artifacts from another dimension. They held a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. He reached for the journal first. The leather was dark, nearly black, and felt unnervingly like skin, cool, supple, and textured with the history of its previous owner. A wax seal, cracked but still clinging to the thread, bore a crest, a lion rampant holding a broken spear. Tom took a deep breath, the air whistling through his narrowed airway, and opened the cover. The handwriting was a dense, elegant script, the kind taught in schools before the world decided speed was more important than clarity. On the first page, in bold, stark ink, was a date, November 14, 1995. If you are reading this, the first entry began, then I am either dead or the world has finally found the courage I lacked. My name is Daniel Hartford. I am a coward, a keeper of secrets, and the brother of a man the world calls a thief. Tom leaned in, the LED lamp above the table casting long sharp shadows across the yellowed paper. My brother, Colonel James Hartford, died 3 weeks ago. He died in a small rented room that smelled of failure and cheap gin. He died with a dishonorable discharge on his record and a stain on his name that no amount of mourning can wash away. But James was not a thief. He was a sacrifice. The words seemed to vibrate off the page, hitting Tom with the force of a physical blow. He knew that tone. He had heard it in the voices of men who had been left behind in the valley, men who had seen the brass cover up a mistake to protect a career. As Tom turned the pages, a narrative of betrayal began to take shape, a story that had been buried for over 40 years. It had started in 1982, during a series of peacetime military exercises in Western Europe. While the world's attention was fixed on the Cold War's shifting borders, a far more ancient kind of plunder was taking place. Daniel's writing grew more frantic as he detailed the heist. James Hartford, then a rising star in the army, had been assigned to oversee logistics for a massive movement of equipment through various European hubs. He had discovered a shadow operation running parallel to his own. Someone was using the cover of military transport, the same trucks, planes, and shipping containers that moved tanks and ammunition, to smuggle priceless Renaissance paintings out of crumbling private estates and smaller, less guarded regional museums. The architects were men James trusted, Daniel wrote. Richard Castellano, a procurement officer with a genius for making things disappear from manifests, and Vincent Moretti, a man of the shadows who knew exactly which private collectors in the States were hungry enough to buy stolen history. Tom's eyes narrowed at the name. Castellano. He'd heard that name on the news. Castellano Defense Systems was one of the largest private contractors in the country. A billionaire titan of industry. The journal detailed how James had initially thought it was a simple black market smuggling ring. He had begun his own investigation, documenting the shipping manifest that didn't match the cargo, taking photographs of crates that should have contained engine parts but held masterpieces worth tens of millions. He thought he was doing his duty. He thought the system would protect him. Instead, the system had been turned against him like a weapon. Castellano and Moretti had realized Hartford was close. They didn't kill him, they did something worse. They planted evidence in his personal quarters, authentication papers, stolen jewelry, and a ledger that made it look like James was the ringleader. They bought witnesses, men under James's command who were threatened with their own court-martials if they didn't testify against him. They broke him. Daniel's ink was blotted here as if he had stopped to weep. They stripped him of his rank, his pension, and his honor. They turned him into a pariah. And I saw the proof. I found the lockbox James had hidden in our mother's attic before they arrested him. I saw the manifest. I saw the truth. But Moretti found me. He told me that if I ever spoke, if I ever tried to clear James's name, my own children wouldn't live to see their next birthday. So I hid it. I hid the truth in a storage unit, under layers of junk, hoping the ghosts would eventually find their own way home. Tom sat back, his chest tight. The parallel to his own life was a bitter, jagged pill. He thought of that day in the sterile room with Captain Hunter. He thought of the operator error that had buried the truth about the faulty hydraulics that had killed Dean. The military, the government, it was a machine. And like any machine, it didn't care about the individual gears, especially the ones that got caught in the works and threatened to stop the motion. James Hartford had been a gear that tried to turn the wrong way, and they had ground him into dust. James's last words to me, the journal continued, were not of anger but of a terrible, quiet plea. Daniel, he said, his voice a ghost of the man who had commanded battalions, give me back my honor. Not for me. For the name. For the children. I am failing that plea even as I write this. I am leaving this world in fear. But perhaps you, the one who found this, are not afraid. Tom looked at the lockbox. According to the journal, this metal square contained the only physical evidence left of the 1982 heist. Shipping manifest signed by Castellano. Photographs of the art in military transit. The original unredacted investigation files that the Army claimed had been lost in a fire. It was a $200 million smoking gun. His hands, despite the palsy, moved to the combination dial. He tried the obvious numbers first. Dates from the journal, James's service number mentioned in passing, Daniel's birth year. Click, click, click. The dial spun, but the latch remained frozen. He tried again, his breath coming in short, ragged hitches. He felt a sudden, desperate need to see what was inside. If he had this evidence, he didn't just have a score. He had a weapon. He could finish the mission James Hartford had started 40 years ago. He could make the machine admit its mistake. 000, 123, 911. Nothing. He slumped back in his chair, the exertion of the day finally catching up to him. His vision blurred for a moment, the room spinning as the cancer made its presence known with a sharp, stabbing pain in his side. He reached for a pill bottle, swallowing a tablet dry, his throat raw. Duke stood up, sensing the shift in Tom's vitals. The dog walked over and rested his heavy head on Tom's lap, his tail giving a single slow thump against the wheelchair's frame. "We're not giving up, Duke," Tom whispered, his hand settling on the dog's head. "This is it. This is the final mission." He looked at the Purple Heart. He realized now why it was there. It wasn't just a medal, it was a symbol of what had been stolen. Not just a piece of metal and ribbon, but the right to be remembered as a hero. Tom looked at the eviction notice on the table, then back at the journal. He had 30 days. 30 days until he was invisible. But if he could find Elena Hartfordson, the granddaughter mentioned in the latter pages of the journal, he could pass the torch. He could fulfill Daniel's dying wish and James's final plea. But as he reached for his phone to start the search, a shadow moved across the small, grimy window of his apartment. It was a flicker, a brief interruption of the street lamp's light, but to a man who had survived ambushes in the dark, it was a siren. Duke's ears flattened. A low, guttural vibration started in his chest, a sound he only made when he was preparing to strike. Tom froze, his hand inches from the journal. He realized with a sudden, cold clarity that the man at the storage facility hadn't been an auction flipper. He had been a scout. And if they knew about the trunk, they knew about the apartment. He looked at the lockbox, then at the door. He didn't have the combination, he didn't have his legs, and he was running out of time. The handle of the apartment door began to turn, slowly, with a deliberate, terrifying silence that suggested the person on the other side didn't just have a key, they had the confidence of someone who knew exactly who was inside, and exactly how little fight he had left. Tom's fingers closed around the handle of the heavy metal lockbox, his only weapon in a room full of ghosts, as the door began to creak open. The morning after the shadow moved across his window, Thomas Kincaid did not wait for the sun to fully crest the jagged skyline of the industrial district. Paranoia, he had learned in the valleys of the Hindu Kush, was only a disparaging word used by people who had never been hunted. To a soldier, it was simply heightened situational awareness. He had spent the night in his reclining chair, the heavy metal lockbox resting in his lap and a tire iron tucked into the side pocket of his wheelchair. Duke had stayed by the door, a silent, unmoving silhouette that only shifted when the floorboards in the hallway groaned under the weight of a passing neighbor. By 7 o'clock, Tom was back in the Econoline. He didn't head to a police station. The system had failed him too many times for him to trust a badge and a report, nor did he return to the storage facility. Instead, he steered the van toward the city's central public library. He needed a secure connection, a neutral ground, and a place where a man in a wheelchair could disappear into the digital stacks without drawing the kind of attention a private investigator might. The library was a massive, neoclassical limestone beast, a monument to a time when knowledge was treated with the same reverence as a cathedral. As Tom maneuvered the van into a handicapped stall, the wind whipped off the river, carrying the scent of snow and wet asphalt. "Stay, Duke," Tom said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He hated this part. The library didn't allow animals, even service dogs, unless they were actively assisting with a visible task during the entirety of the visit, and Tom knew the sensory overload of the crowded computer lab would only stress the animal. More importantly, he needed Duke to be his rearguard. "Watch the van, boy. Watch the perimeter." Duke looked at him, his amber eyes filled with a protest that broke Tom's heart, but the dog sat back in the passenger seat. He knew the tone. He knew the mission. Tom reached over and scratched the thick fur behind Duke's ears one last time before activating the lift. The metallic whine of the machinery felt louder in the morning silence, a beacon for anyone who might be following. Tom scanned the parking lot, a silver sedan 3 rows back, a municipal truck, a few salt-crusted commuters. Nothing screamed assassin, but the itch between his shoulder blades remained. Inside the library, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and the hum of industrial heaters. Tom made his way to the row of public terminals in the basement, a place where the light was dim and the transients often sought refuge among the carols. He found a terminal in the corner, positioned so his back was to the wall, and began the digital excavation of a ghost. He started with the name, James Hartford. The search results came in a flood of digitized black and white archives. The headlines from 1982 were brutal. CO champion of the Cold War stripped of rank. The colonel who plundered Europe. Hartford's shame. Tom scrolled through the scans of the Army Times and the Washington Post. There were photos of a younger James Hartford, a man with a jaw like a granite block and eyes that looked like they could see through a mountain. He looked like the kind of officer Tom would have followed into the mouth of hell. But the later photos showed a different man, shoulders slumped, head bowed as he walked out of a military courtroom, his uniform stripped of the eagles that had once defined him. The court-martial records were a masterpiece of bureaucratic execution. The prosecution had presented a mountain of evidence: shipping manifests signed in Hartford's hand, stolen artifacts found in his personal quarters at the base in Frankfurt, and a ledger of payments from a known black market art dealer named Vincent Moretti. Hartford had maintained his innocence to the end, claiming he had been framed while investigating a smuggling ring involving procurement officers. But the testimony of a Major Richard Castellano, a man described as a whistleblower for the integrity of the service, had sealed Hartford's fate. Tom felt a cold, familiar rage simmering in his gut. He knew the play. He had seen it in Afghanistan when a supply sergeant had been blamed for a missing shipment of fuel that had actually been sold to local insurgents by a lieutenant colonel looking for a promotion. He searched for the obituary next. October 1995. It was a small, clinical notice, tucked away in a suburban New Jersey paper. James Hartford, 63, formerly of the United States Army. No mention of his medals. No mention of the Purple Heart Tom now had in his possession. The notice was brief, survived by his son, Marcus, and a granddaughter, Elena. Tom's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He looked for Marcus. A trail of broken addresses, a bankruptcy filing in 2002, and finally, a death certificate from 2010. Liver failure. The shame of the father had evidently become the poison of the son. But then there was Elena. Tom's breath hitched as the search results shifted from the grainy past to the high-definition present. Elena Hartfordshin. The first image was a professional headshot from a website for the Whitmore Gallery. She was 42, her hair a sharp, dark bob, her eyes holding the same piercing, uncompromising intensity he had seen in the photos of her grandfather. Her curriculum vitae was a list of prestigious accolades: Masters in Fine Arts from Yale, a doctorate in art history from the Sorbonne, a specialization in Renaissance authentication. She hadn't just become an art expert. She had become a specialist in the very field that had destroyed her family. She had spent 20 years learning how to tell a masterpiece from a forgery, how to trace the provenance of a painting through the darkest corners of history. "You're looking for the truth," Tom whispered to the flickering screen. "You've been looking for it your whole life." He looked at her current position: senior authenticator at the Whitmore Gallery, one of the most prestigious art institutions in the city. It was located in the heart of the Golden Triangle, a place of marble floors and silent security guards, a world away from the storage units and the subsidized housing projects. Tom realized he couldn't just call her. A man with his voice, calling from a blocked number talking about stolen art and a 40-year-old conspiracy, would be dismissed as a crank or a threat before he could finish a sentence. He needed to be precise. He needed to be military. He opened a word processing document and began to type. His fingers were stiff, the palsy making the keys clatter, but the words came with the clarity of a field report. 2. Elena Hartfordshin from SFC Thomas Kincaid, Ret. Subject: Colonel James Hartford / 1982 investigation. Miss Hartfordshin, my name is Thomas Kincaid. I am a retired sergeant first class. I recently came into possession of a military trunk belonging to your family. Inside this trunk, I discovered a hidden compartment containing personal effects and evidence related to the 1982 court-martial of your grandfather, Colonel James Hartford. I have in my possession: 1. A Purple Heart medal. 2. A leather-bound journal belonging to Daniel Hartford, dated 1995. 3. A locked metal box containing shipping manifests and authentication documents. After reading your Uncle Daniel's journal, I believe your grandfather was the victim of a coordinated frame-up by Richard Castellano and Vincent Moretti. I have the proof. I'm not asking for money. I am a soldier and I believe in completing the mission. Your grandfather's honor deserves to be restored. I will be at the Veterans Memorial in Riverside Park at 10 a.m. this Saturday. I will be in a wheelchair, accompanied by a German Shepherd. If you wish to see the evidence, come alone. Respectfully, Thomas Kincaid. He printed the letter on the library's laser printer, the mechanical whirring sounding like a countdown. He then went to the photocopier and made a grainy black and white copy of the first page of Daniel's journal, the page that named Castellano. He took a photo of the Purple Heart with his burner phone and printed that as well. He stuffed the documents into a heavy manila envelope, sealed it with tape, and addressed it to the Whitmore Gallery. As he exited the library, the cold hit him like a physical blow. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, a coughing fit that left him doubled over in his chair, gasping for air that felt like it was being filtered through broken glass. He pulled a tattered handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his mouth. It came away stained with a dark, alarming crimson. Duke was waiting. The dog stood up the moment Tom appeared, his tail giving a single tentative wag, but his eyes were fixed on Tom's face. He knew. He could smell the decay, the way the cancer was eating through the last of Tom's reserves. Tom drove to a post office 3 miles away, ensuring he wasn't followed, and sent the letter via certified mail. He watched the clerk take the envelope, feeling a strange sense of vertigo. He had pulled the trigger. The bullet was in the air. The next 3 days were a slow descent into a private purgatory. Tom stayed in the apartment, the heat turned up to 80 degrees, yet he still shivered under 3 blankets. He didn't eat. The very thought of food made his stomach churn. He survived on water, black coffee, and the remaining morphine pills he had been hoarding for the end stage. Duke never left his side. The dog was a silent sentinel, sleeping at the foot of the reclining chair, his head always facing the door. Every time the elevator down the hall groaned or a car backfired in the street, Duke's ears would swivel, his body tensing into a coil of muscle and fur. He was the only thing keeping Tom anchored to the world. On Thursday, the pain became unbearable. It was a searing, white-hot iron pressed against his ribs, making every breath a conscious, agonizing effort. Tom knew he had an appointment at the VA oncology clinic, a follow-up he had considered skipping. But the need for more pain medication, and perhaps a desperate hope for a few more days of lucidity, drove him to the van. The clinic was a place of fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial-grade disinfectant. It was filled with men like Tom, men with gray skin and haunted eyes, sitting in plastic chairs, waiting for the system to give them another month or another week. "Thomas," Dr. Aris said, walking into the exam room. The doctor looked tired, his lab coat wrinkled, but his eyes were soft. He looked at Tom's chart, then at the man in the chair. "You missed your last 2 blood draws." "I've been busy, Doc," Tom rasped. Aris pulled a stool over and sat down, his voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. "Thomas, the scans from last month. The tumor in the right lobe has metastasized. It's moving into the pleural space. That's why you're coughing blood. That's why the pain is localized there." Tom nodded slowly. He didn't need a doctor to tell him he was dying. He could feel the shadow growing inside him. "We need to start the next round of chemotherapy immediately," Aris said. "And the immunotherapy trial, I managed to get you a hardship waiver for the paperwork, but the copay for the facility fees is it's $12,000 for the first month. The foundation can't cover the private lab costs." Tom looked at the doctor. $12,000. He had $85 3 days ago. Now he had $12 and some change in his pocket. "I can't do it, Doc," Tom said. "Thomas, listen to me. Without the treatment, without the intervention, your lungs are going to fill. The pain will become unmanageable even for the morphine. You're looking at a window of maybe 3 months. Possibly less if the infection takes hold. 3 months. In the military, 3 months was an eternity. You could take a city in 3 months. You could lose a country in 3 months. Will I be able to move?" Tom asked. "Will I be able to, think?" Aris sighed, a long, weary sound. "For the first few weeks, yes. But you'll grow weaker every day. The fatigue will be absolute. By the end of the 2nd month, you'll likely be bedbound." "Give me the pills, Doc," Tom said, his voice hard. "The heavy stuff. Just enough to keep me upright for the weekend." "Thomas?" "I have a mission," Tom interrupted, his eyes locking onto the doctor's with a ferocity that made the younger man blink. "I don't need 3 months of sitting in a bed. I need 3 days of being a soldier. Can you give me that?" Aris looked at him for a long time. He saw the fire in the dying man's eyes, the stubborn, irrational resolve of a man who had decided that the manner of his death was less important than the purpose of his final hours. "I'll give you a prescription for a higher dose of the extended-release oxycodone," Aris said quietly, "and a steroid burst to help with the inflammation in your lungs. It'll give you a temporary rally. But Thomas, when the rally ends, the crash will be twice as hard." "I've survived crashes before," Tom said. He left the clinic with a white paper bag clutched in his hand. As he wheeled himself out to the van, he looked at the sky. It was a flat, featureless gray, the kind of sky that promised nothing but more cold. Saturday morning arrived with a dusting of fine, powdery snow. Tom spent an hour preparing. He shaved his face, his hand shaking so badly he nicked his chin twice, the blood bright against the gray stubble. He put on his best flannel shirt and his leather jacket, pinning his old unit crest to the underside of the collar, a private reminder of who he was. He checked the lockbox. He checked the journal. He tucked them into a bag hanging from the back of his wheelchair. Riverside Park was a ribbon of brown grass and skeletal trees along the water. The Veterans Memorial was a simple circle of granite pillars inscribed with the names of the fallen from every conflict since the Civil War. It was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic on the parkway and the cry of a lone gull over the river. Tom positioned his chair near the pillar for the Vietnam War, his back to the wind. Duke sat beside him, his coat dusted with snow, his head held high. He looked like a statue, a guardian of the dead. 10 a.m. came and went. 10:15 a.m. A jogger passed by, their breath a white cloud in the air. A woman pushing a stroller moved along the path, not even glancing at the man in the wheelchair. Tom felt a cold knot of doubt tightening in his chest. Maybe she hadn't gotten the letter. Maybe she thought he was a lunatic. Maybe she didn't care about the honor of a man who had died before she was old enough to know him. He felt a coughing fit building in his chest. He suppressed it, his face turning a dark, mottled purple, his eyes watering. Not now. Not yet. Then he heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. They were quick, rhythmic, the sound of high-end leather on stone. Tom turned his chair. Walking toward him was the woman from the photograph. She was wearing a long, camel-colored wool coat, her face partially obscured by a silk scarf. She looked out of place in the bleak, winter-stripped park, too elegant, too polished. She stopped 10 feet away. Her eyes went from Tom's weathered, dying face to the dog, and finally to the granite pillars of the memorial. "Mr. Kincaid?" she asked. Her voice was exactly as he had imagined, cool, professional, but with a slight, unmistakable tremor at the edges. Tom nodded. "Miss Hartfordshire." She took a step closer, her gaze intensifying. She looked at his denim jacket, the way his hands gripped the wheels of his chair, and the bag hanging from the back. "You sent me a letter," she said. "You sent me a page from my uncle's journal. How did you get it?" "I bought a storage unit," Tom said. "Unit 247. It belonged to your family." Elena's face went pale, a stark contrast to her dark hair. "That unit? We lost track of it after my father died. My mother told me it was cleared out years ago. She told me there was nothing left but old furniture." "There was a military trunk," Tom said. "Your grandfather's. It had a false bottom." He reached into the bag and pulled out the velvet case. He opened it, revealing the purple heart. The gold heart seemed to glow in the flat, gray light of the morning. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She took 2 steps forward, her composure shattering. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the silk lining of the case. He always said they took it," she whispered. "He told me the army took his medals when they took his rank. He told me he had nothing left to leave me." "He hid it," Tom said. "He hid the heart. And he hid the truth." He reached back into the bag and pulled out the leather-bound journal. He held it out to her. Elena took the book as if it were made of glass. She opened the cover, her eyes scanning the dense, elegant script of her uncle. As she read the name Castellano, her jaw tightened, a flash of pure, cold steel appearing in her eyes. "I've known," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've known my whole life that something was wrong. My father died in a bottle because of what they did to his father. I became an authenticator because I wanted to find the paintings. I wanted to trace the theft back to the source. I have the shipping manifests," Tom said. "I have the lockbox. It's all here, Elena. The names, the dates, the signatures." Elena looked up from the journal, her eyes searching Tom's. "What? Why are you doing this for a man you never met? For a family that means nothing to you?" Tom looked at the granite pillars, at the thousands of names etched into the stone. He thought of Miller. He thought of Henderson. He thought of himself, sitting in a room, waiting for the eviction notice to become a reality. "Because I'm a soldier," Tom said. "And we don't leave our own behind. Not even the ones who are already gone." Elena opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Duke stood up. A low, thunderous growl started in his throat, his hackles rising like a row of jagged teeth. Tom turned his chair, his hand instinctively reaching for the tire iron in the side pocket. 2 black SUVs had pulled up onto the grass of the park 50 yards away. The doors opened in unison and 4 men in dark, nondescript coats stepped out. They weren't joggers. They weren't tourists. They moved with the synchronized, purposeful stride of a recovery team. At the lead was the man from the storage facility, the man in the tactical jacket. He didn't have the high-frequency device this time. He had a suppressed pistol held low against his thigh. "Elena, get behind me," Tom commanded, the old Sergeant First Class returning in an instant. "Who are they?" Elena asked, her voice rising in panic. "The people who don't want your grandfather's honor restored," Tom said. He looked at the distance between them and the SUVs. They were trapped in the circle of the memorial. The man in the tactical jacket stopped 20 feet away. He didn't look at Tom. He looked at Elena. "Miss Hartfordshire," the man said, his voice calm and terrifyingly polite. "You're in possession of property that belongs to Castellano Defense Systems. If you hand over the bag and the journal now, we can all go home. Mr. Kincaid is a very sick man. He doesn't need the stress of a confrontation." Tom gripped the handles of his chair, his knuckles white. He felt the steroid rally surging through his veins, a temporary, artificial strength. "The property belongs to the Hartford family," Tom said. "And you're trespassing on sacred ground." The man smiled, the same lightless smile from the storage unit. "Sacred ground is for the dead, Sergeant. We're here for the living." As the man raised the pistol, a third vehicle, a battered, primer-gray pickup truck, roared over the curb of the parkway, tires screaming as it drifted across the grass, heading directly for the space between Tom and the SUVs. The driver slammed on the brakes, sending a plume of snow and turf into the air. A woman with short-cropped gray hair and a face like a weathered map leaned out the window, a Benelli M4 shotgun resting on the doorframe. "Get in the damn truck, Kincaid," the woman roared. Tom recognized her instantly. It was Colonel Sarah Baptiste. But as Elena scrambled toward the truck and Tom heaved his chair forward, he saw the man in the tactical jacket adjust his aim, not at Tom and not at Elena but at the tires of the pickup. And then, from the trees behind the memorial, a second, muffled pop echoed through the park, and the rear window of Baptiste's truck shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Tom realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't just being recovered. They were being liquidated. As Duke lunged forward, a black blur of teeth and fury, Tom felt the lockbox in his lap begin to vibrate again. A rhythmic, pulsing heat that seemed to be responding to something in the SUVs. "Elena, the journal." Tom screamed as he reached for her, but his wheels caught in the fresh snow, and he began to tip. The last thing he saw before the world went white was the man in the tactical jacket stepping forward, his eyes fixed on the lockbox with a hunger that had nothing to do with art. Who was the second shooter in the trees, and what secret did the lockbox hold that made it pulse with a life of its own? The air at the Riverside Park Veterans Memorial didn't just carry a chill, it carried the weight of names. Thousands of them, etched into cold granite pillars that stood like silent sentinels overlooking the slate-gray waters of the Monongahela. Thomas Kincaid sat in his wheelchair, positioned with his back against the Vietnam-era monument, a location chosen not for comfort, but for tactical advantage. From this vantage point, he had a clear, unobstructed view of the gravel parking lot, the main pedestrian artery, and the fatal funnels created by the surrounding skeletal oak trees. Old habits didn't die, even when the body they inhabited was withering from the inside out. The steroid burst Dr. Aris had prescribed was humming through Tom's system, a strange, artificial vibration that made his skin feel tight and his thoughts unusually sharp. For the first time in weeks, the fog of fatigue had lifted, replaced by a crystalline focus. He knew it was a loan he'd have to pay back with interest later, but for now, the mission was the only thing keeping the pain at bay. Beside him, Duke sat in a perfect watch position, his ears twitching at the distant hum of traffic on the parkway. The dog was a statue of muscle and fur, his eyes scanning the horizon with the same weary vigilance as his master. At 10:04 a.m., a dark sedan pulled into the lot. A woman stepped out, her movements brisk and controlled. Even from 50 yards away, Tom could see the resemblance to the grainy photos in the library. She wore a long charcoal wool coat and a silk scarf that fluttered in the biting wind. As she approached, her gaze shifted from the monuments to the lone man in the wheelchair. She walked with a professional gait, shoulders back, head high, but as she drew closer, Tom saw the guarded skepticism in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had been approached by too many conspiracy theorists and broken men over the years. Elena Hartfordshire stopped exactly 6 feet away, a respectful but cautious distance. Her face was a landscape of sharp angles and guarded emotions. Up close, the intensity in her amber eyes was startling. It was the same fire Tom had seen in her grandfather's court-martial photos. "Mr. Kincaid?" she asked. Her voice was steady, refined, but it carried the brittle edge of someone who had practiced her composure until it was a suit of armor. "Sergeant First Class Kincaid," Tom corrected softly, his voice a dry rasp. "But Tom works fine for today." Elena nodded, her eyes flicking to Duke, then back to the manila envelope resting on Tom's lap. You sent me a very specific letter, Mr. Kincaid. You mentioned a storage unit. You mentioned a trunk. She paused, her breath a white plume in the air. My family has been trying to forget that storage unit for 20 years. My mother sold the contents to a blind auction after my father's funeral because she couldn't stand the smell of the past. Why is it finding me now? Tom didn't answer with words. He reached into the bag hanging from the side of his chair and pulled out the velvet presentation case. He flipped the lid open with his thumb. The purple heart caught the weak winter sun, its gold-bordered heart and the purple silk ribbon standing out against the gray morning like a fresh wound. Elena's composure didn't just crack, it evaporated. She took a sharp, jagged breath, her hands flying to her chest. She took 2 steps forward, her gaze fixed on the metal as if it were a ghost. He said they took it, she whispered, her voice trembling. When they marched him out of the courtroom in Frankfurt, he told my father they stripped the heart right off his chest. He died believing the country he bled for had officially decided his blood didn't count. They didn't take it, Tom said, his voice firm. He hid it, along with the truth. He knew the system was rigged, so he played a different game. He left a breadcrumb trail that took 40 years to find. Tom handed her the leather-bound journal. Elena took it with reverent hands, her fingers tracing the wax seal of the lion rampant. As she opened the first page and saw the elegant, dense script of her Uncle Daniel, a single tear escaped and tracked a path through her makeup. She read in silence for several minutes, the only sound the rustle of the wind through the dead leaves. Daniel was always the quiet one, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. He disappeared shortly after my grandfather's death. We thought he just couldn't handle the shame. We never knew he was living in fear. He was protecting this, Tom said, patting the heavy, matte black lockbox resting in his lap. Your grandfather was investigating a heist of Renaissance masterpieces during the 1982 exercises. He found the manifest. He found the evidence that Richard Castellano was using military transport to move stolen art for the Moretti family. He was framed because he was the only one who wouldn't take a cut. Elena looked up, the grief in her eyes hardening into something else, something cold and dangerous. I know who Castellano is. Every person in the art world knows. He's not just a defense contractor, he's a philanthropist. He sits on the boards of 3 major museums. And the Morettis? They've laundered their reputation through high-end galleries in New York and London. They are the legitimate face of international art trade now. She looked back at the journal, her jaw tightening. My father died in a VA hospital, Mr. Kincaid. He spent his final years in a haze of alcohol because he couldn't live with the idea that his hero was a thief. He believed the official record. I spent 20 years becoming an authenticator just so I could understand how they did it. I've looked at the provenance of every piece Castellano has ever donated, but the records are always clean. Too clean. Because the real records are in here, Tom said, tapping the lockbox. Daniel says it contains the original shipping manifests with Castellano's signatures. It has photographs of the art in the military crates. It's the chain of custody they thought they'd burned. Elena reached out and touched the cold steel of the box. Her expertise was evident in the way she looked at the reinforced edges and the high-security dial. If this contains what you say it does, it doesn't just clear my grandfather's name. It would trigger a global restitution case worth hundreds of millions. It would dismantle Castellano's empire and pull the mask off the Moretti family for good. She looked at Tom, her skepticism long gone, replaced by a desperate, hopeful curiosity. Why give this to me? Why not go to the authorities? To the FBI art crime team? Because the system is what broke your grandfather, Tom said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. And it's what's currently waiting for me to die so it can close my file. Castellano has friends in the Pentagon, in the DOJ, in the galleries. If I hand this to a faceless agent, it'll end up in a shredder before the ink dries. This needs to be personal. It needs to be a mission. I can't do this alone, Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. If I start asking questions with this evidence, they'll see me coming. I'm an academic, not a soldier. I'm a soldier, Tom said, but I'm a soldier who's running out of time. I've got maybe 3 months, Elena. Maybe less. Suddenly Duke's ears pinned back. A low, vibrating growl started in his chest, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through the granite pillars. Tom's tactical brain snapped back to the present. He didn't look around immediately. He used the reflective surface of the black granite Vietnam Wall to scan the area behind them. 100 yards away, parked across the street near the park's northern exit, was a black SUV with tinted windows. It hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. No one had gotten out. The engine was running. He could see the faint wisps of exhaust in the cold air. "Don't look," Tom whispered sharply. "Black SUV. 2 o'clock. Elena stiffened, but she had the sense to keep her eyes on the journal. "They're already watching me. My office was ransacked 2 nights ago. I thought it was just a random burglary, but after your letter..." She swallowed hard. "They know I'm here. And now they've seen you." Tom felt the adrenaline spike cutting through the steroid-induced calm. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a historical mystery anymore. It was an active theater of operations. "We need a fire team," Tom said, his eyes scanning for an exit route. "We need people who know how to fight the machine and the shadows at the same time." Elena nodded, her professional mask sliding back into place, but there was a new urgency in her movements. "I know 2 people. People who have been waiting for a crack in the Castellano wall as long as I have. One is Colonel Sarah Baptiste. She's retired now, but she was a junior officer in the 10th Mountain during the Hartford case. She always suspected the cover-up, but she was told to stand down. She has the military connections we don't." "And the other?" Tom asked, his hand tightening on the wheel of his chair. "Ray Donovan. He's a private investigator, but that's just the title on his door. He specializes in recovering stolen art from people who think they're above the law. He's ex-insurance, ex-Interpol. He's been tracking the Moretti family's legitimate sales for a decade." Tom looked at the SUV. It had begun to roll forward, slowly hugging the curb. They were being hemmed in. "We can't stay here," Tom said. "And we can't go to your office or my apartment. They're burned." "Baptiste has a farm," Elena said, her voice low and fast. "About 40 miles outside the city. It's a secure location. She calls it her retirement bunker. If we can get there, we can open this box and build the case before they can silence us." "Go to your car," Tom commanded. "Drive normal. Don't speed, don't look back. I'll follow in the van. If we get separated, head for the farm. Do you have the address?" "I have it," Elena said. She tucked the journal into her coat and gripped the velvet metal case like a lifeline. She looked at Tom, a profound, silent understanding passing between the dying veteran and the granddaughter of the man he was trying to save. "Thank you, Thomas." "Don't thank me yet," Tom said. "The mission isn't over." As Elena turned and walked toward the parking lot, Tom waited. He let her get a 30-second lead. He watched as the black SUV stayed put for a moment, then began to pull out, following her at a discreet distance. Tom gripped the rims of his chair, his muscles screaming as he heaved himself toward his van. The steroid rally was beginning to flicker, the first hint of the coming crash. He could feel the fluid in his lungs, the familiar bubbling rattle that signaled a coughing fit was only minutes away. "Come on, boy," Tom rasped to Duke. "We've got a tail to lose." He reached the Econoline, the lift groaning in the silence of the park. As he hauled himself into the driver's seat, his eyes stayed glued to the rearview mirror. Elena's sedan turned onto the parkway, the black SUV trailing 2 cars back. But as Tom pulled out of the parking lot, he noticed something that made the hair on his arms stand up. A second vehicle, a nondescript gray minivan, had pulled out from a side street and was now tucked in behind him. It didn't have the tinted windows of a security detail. It had a ladder rack on top and a "How's my driving?" sticker on the bumper. It looked like a work vehicle. But as the minivan followed him through 3 turns, maintaining a perfect 4-car-length gap, Tom realized the SUV wasn't following Elena to stop her. It was a decoy. The real threat was behind him, and as he hit the highway, the minivan began to accelerate, its headlights flashing in a rhythmic, coded pattern that Tom hadn't seen since his days in the signal's corps. A signal that meant target acquired, preparing for intercept. Tom's hand went to the lockbox on the seat beside him. The black metal felt hot, almost pulsing, and as the minivan swerved into the left lane to pull alongside him, Tom saw the driver, a man with a headset and the same silver lion rampant pin on his lapel. Why was the lockbox reacting to the proximity of the pursuers, and what kind of recovery were they actually authorized to perform? The gravel driveway of the Baptiste farm was a 2-mile gauntlet of potholes and frozen mud that seemed designed to shake the very soul out of anyone brave enough to traverse it. Situated 40 miles outside the city's industrial sprawl, the property was tucked into a hollow of dense hemlocks and skeletal oaks, invisible from the main road. It wasn't just a farm, it was a fortress of solitude. The farmhouse was a low-slung, stone-walled structure that looked like it had grown out of the earth itself, reinforced by the kind of perimeter lighting and motion sensors that hinted at its owner's former life. Thomas Kincaid's Econoline groaned as it came to a halt in the shadow of a massive red barn. The pursuit had ended 10 miles back when Tom, using a tactical maneuver he'd last employed in the streets of Jalalabad, had forced the gray minivan into a soft-shoulder ditch. He had watched the driver in his rearview, not an assassin but a corporate recovery agent, scrambling for a phone as Tom disappeared into the maze of backroads. But the victory felt hollow. Every jolt of the van had been a hammer blow to his lungs, and as the engine died, the silence of the farm was broken only by the sound of Tom's own ragged, wet breathing. "Easy, Duke," Tom rasped, his hand trembling as he reached for the lift controls. The door to the stone house opened, and a woman stepped out into the biting wind. Colonel Sarah Baptiste was 65, but she stood with the rigid, uncompromising verticality of a person who had spent 40 years in a dress uniform. Her hair was a shock of iron gray, cut into a sharp military bob, and her eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, scanned the driveway with a veteran's scrutiny. She didn't offer a smile. She simply watched as Elena's sedan followed Tom's van into the yard, her gaze lingering on the man in the wheelchair. Standing behind her was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a very expensive piece of mahogany. Ray Donovan was in his late 50s, wearing a high-end trench coat over a tailored suit that seemed wildly out of place in the mud of a Pennsylvania farm. He had the calm, observant air of a man who spent his life looking for the one loose thread that could unravel a billion-dollar lie. For 30 years, he had been the shadow the art world feared, the man who found the unfindable and recovered the stolen from people who believed themselves untouchable. "Kincaid," Baptiste said, her voice a deep, commanding alto. "You look like hell. And that van looks like it's been through a meat grinder." "Met some friends of yours on the highway, Colonel," Tom replied, his wheels crunching on the frozen grit as he moved toward the porch. "They were wearing the lion rampant." Baptiste's jaw tightened. "Castellano's dogs. They've gotten bold. Get inside. The kettle's on and the room is swept for bugs." Ray's already seen the digital files Elena sent over, but he's a man who likes to touch the evidence. Inside, the farmhouse's rustic exterior gave way to a high-tech command center. Maps of European logistics hubs were pinned to the walls next to infrared monitors showing the property's perimeter. They gathered around a heavy oak table in the kitchen, the air smelling of pine needles and strong coffee. Tom didn't waste time with pleasantries. He placed the leather journal, the Purple Heart, and the matte black lockbox on the table. The weight of the items seemed to draw the air out of the room. Elena sat next to him, her face pale but her eyes burning with an intensity that matched the Colonel's. "I spent 20 years regretting that I didn't push harder," Baptiste said, her fingers brushing the cover of Daniel Hartford's journal. "I was a captain back in '82. I saw the inconsistencies in the manifests, but when I brought them to the IG, I was told the files were classified for national security. A week later, Hartford was in shackles and I was being transferred to a desk in Alaska. They buried a hero to protect a pipeline of stolen history." Ray Donovan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the lockbox. He pulled a pair of white silk gloves from his pocket and put them on with a methodical grace. "The Moretti family doesn't just sell art, Thomas. They sell legitimacy. If this box contains the original manifests, it's not just proof of a theft. It's a death warrant for their entire operation. But these boxes, they're designed with a burn protocol. If the dial is forced, a small thermite charge inside ignites, turning the contents to ash. Which is why we aren't going to force it," Baptiste said. She walked to a cabinet and pulled out a small velvet-lined kit containing specialized listening devices and a set of precision calipers. The Army used these boxes for sensitive courier transport in the '80s. The combination isn't just numbers, it's a rhythm. For 20 minutes, the room was silent except for the rhythmic click-whir of the dial and the steady, heavy breathing of Duke, who sat at Tom's feet. Baptiste worked with the focus of a bomb technician, her ear pressed against a digital amplifier. Click, click, thud. The heavy steel latch popped upward with a sound like a muffled gunshot. Baptiste exhaled a breath she'd been holding since 1982 and slowly lifted the lid. The contents were a time capsule of corruption. Ray began laying the items out on the table. First, a stack of original shipping manifests, the paper yellowed but the ink still stark. Tom's eyes went to the signature line at the bottom, Major Richard Castellano. The dates matched the 1982 exercises perfectly. Next were 8 high-resolution photographs, Polaroids that had been preserved in airtight plastic. They showed massive wooden crates in a military warehouse, several of them partially pried open to reveal the ornate, gilded frames of Renaissance masterpieces. "My God," Elena whispered, her hand trembling as she picked up one of the photos. That's the Madonna of the Lilies. It was reported destroyed during a fire in a private collection in Florence in '81. It's worth $60 million on its own. And here's why the army couldn't find the evidence, Baptiste said, pulling out a thick blue-bound folder. This is the original investigation report James Hartford filed before he was arrested. It's been stamped redacted and devolved, but this copy is untouched. He had everyone, Castellano, Moretti, and even a few names in the State Department. But the final piece of evidence was the most damning. It was a small handwritten note on a piece of official army stationery, tucked into a pocket of the lockbox. It was addressed to Vincent Moretti. Hartford's getting close. He's seen the manifest for the Frankfurt shipment. Handle it. We can't afford a leak this close to the move. RC. That's the smoking gun, Ray said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. A direct order to frame a superior officer to protect a criminal enterprise. Elena leaned over the table, her expertise taking over. She pulled a magnifying loupe from her bag and began examining the authentication certificates that were bundled with the manifests. These are the original museum pedigree papers. They prove the works were stolen from public trust, not private sales. Ray, I've tracked 3 of these pieces, the Madonna, the Vinci landscape, and the Vatican study. They aren't hidden. They are currently hanging in the Moretti Gallery's private collection wing downtown. I can verify the serial numbers on the frames if I can get close enough, Ray added. But we have a problem. Evidence like this has a way of disappearing from police lockups. Castellano isn't just a businessman. He's a donor to the very people who would be investigating him. We can't go to the law. Not yet. We need the court of public opinion, Baptiste said, her eyes narrowing. We need someone who can drop this like a nuclear bomb before they can suppress it. She turned to Tom. I've been in touch with Marcus Webb. He's an investigative journalist who specializes in military corruption. He's been trying to nail Castellano for years, but he's always lacked the primary documents. With these, he can bury them. We have to move fast, Tom rasped. He felt a cold, oily sensation in the back of his throat. The steroid rally was failing him. The sharp, crystalline focus was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a dull, throbbing pressure behind his eyes. Castellano knows. He knows I have the box. He's not going to wait for a headline. Tom's right, Elena said, looking at him with concern. We need to authenticate the paintings in the gallery tonight, match them to these papers, and get everything to Webb by morning. Ray stood up, adjusting his cuffs. I'll handle the gallery. I have a membership that gets me in after hours. Elena, I need you with me to confirm the brushwork. Colonel, stay here with Thomas and guard the documents. I'm going with you, Tom said, his voice cracking. He tried to grip the rims of his chair, but his fingers felt like lead. Suddenly the room began to tilt. The infrared monitors on the wall seemed to bleed into the maps, the red and green lights blurring into a sickening neon smear. Tom felt a sudden violent surge of heat in his chest, followed by a sensation of falling, even though he was still sitting. Thomas? Elena's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. He tried to answer, but his jaw locked. A sharp, metallic taste flooded his mouth, the taste of a coming storm. Duke's reaction was instantaneous. The German shepherd erupted into a series of frantic, booming barks, his body lunging forward to catch Tom's shoulder as the man began to slide from his chair. Duke wasn't just barking. He was alerting, his nose nudging Tom's hand, his body a living brace. Tom's eyes rolled back. His body stiffened, a violent tremor seizing his limbs as the cancer, now a rampant invader in his neurological pathways, triggered a massive seizure. He's crashing. Baptiste shouted, her military training kicking in as she lunged to catch him before he hit the floor. Ray, help me get him flat. Elena, get the med kit from the pantry, now. The room dissolved into a frantic blur of motion. Duke refused to leave Tom's side, his whining a high-pitched, desperate sound that cut through the chaos. Baptiste held Tom's head, her face a mask of grim determination, while Elena fumbled with a syringe of emergency anti-seizure medication. As the tremor subsided, Tom lay on the cold stone floor, his breathing shallow and thready. His skin had turned a terrifying translucent shade of gray, the blue veins in his temples standing out like a roadmap of his decline. His pulse is thready, Baptiste whispered, her fingers on his neck. The cancer isn't just in the lungs anymore. It's everywhere. We have to get him to the hospital, Elena cried, her eyes wide with terror. If we go to a public hospital, Castellano will find him in an hour, Ray said, his voice cold and analytical even in the crisis. but he won't survive the night without an ICU. Tom's eyes flickered open for a fraction of a second. He saw the faces of the team, the granddaughter of a hero, the colonel who had found her courage, and the investigator who sought justice in the shadows. He looked at the lockbox on the table, the gold-leafed manifest still visible. Complete. The mission, Tom managed to whisper, a single drop of blood trailing from the corner of his mouth. As they lifted him onto a makeshift stretcher to rush him to a private clinic, Baptiste kept on retainer for sensitive injuries. Duke stayed glued to his side, his nose tucked into Tom's hand. The drive was a desperate race against a clock that was finally running out of seconds. As the lights of the city began to loom in the distance, Tom felt the darkness closing in, not the darkness of the night, but the absolute, crushing weight of the end. But as his consciousness faded, he felt a strange, rhythmic vibration through the floor of the van, a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was the sound of a heavy, high-performance engine, and as Baptiste looked into the side mirror, her face went deathly pale. "They're not waiting for the gallery," she said, her hand reaching for the shotgun. "They're here for the evidence, and they're not taking prisoners." As Tom slipped into a coma, the 3 black SUVs boxed in the ambulance on the dark highway, but they didn't realize that Ray Donovan had already made one final desperate call, to a man who didn't exist on any official record. The ceiling of the intensive care unit was a grid of perforated tiles, each tiny hole a dark eye watching the slow, rhythmic dance of Thomas Kincaid's survival. The air was pressurized and sterile, tasting of ozone and the metallic tang of high-end pharmaceuticals. Tom lay beneath a thin, white sheet, his body a map of plastic tubing and adhesive sensors. The ventilator's rhythmic whoosh click was the only thing keeping the silence of the room from becoming absolute. He was weak, so weak that the simple act of blinking felt like hauling a heavy pack up a steep ridge, but he was conscious. The seizure had been a lightning strike across his neural pathways, leaving behind a charred trail of exhaustion, yet the core of his mind remained a fortified bunker. He knew he didn't have much time. He could feel the cancer moving, a restless, heavy shadow in his chest that seemed to grow thicker with every shallow breath. But he wasn't dead yet, and as long as he was breathing, the mission was live. The heavy door to the ICU suite swished open. It wasn't a nurse or the weary Dr. Eris. It was a man in a charcoal suit that cost more than Tom's van, a man whose face was a polished mask of professional indifference. He carried a leather briefcase like a shield and walked with the quiet, predatory grace of someone who lived in the air-conditioned heights of corporate law. "Mr. Kincaid," the man said, his voice a smooth, modulated baritone. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I represent the interests of Castellano Defense Systems." Tom didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the ceiling. "You're late. I expected your boss to send a Reaper, not a suit." Sterling didn't flinch. He pulled a chair to the side of the bed, the screech of metal on linoleum sounding like a serrated blade. "Mr. Castellano is a man of great patience, but he is also a pragmatist. He understands that you are a man of service, a man who has sacrificed much for this country. He would like to help you." "Help me?" Tom rasped, the words catching in the fluid in his lungs. He spent 40 years building an empire on the bones of an honorable man. He doesn't help people. He liquidates them. Sterling opened his briefcase, pulling out a single sheet of paper and a sleek, silver fountain pen. "This is a non-disclosure agreement. It is very simple. In exchange for the contents of the storage unit, specifically the trunk and any items found within a concealed compartment, Mr. Castellano will deposit $100,000 into a trust for your medical expenses. It would cover the experimental treatment Dr. Eris mentioned. It would save your life, Thomas." Tom's eyes finally moved. He looked at Sterling, and for a moment, the dying man's gaze held the terrifying, cold intensity of the sergeant first class who had held a ridge in the Cunard. 100,000. That's the price of a man's honor these days? I spent my last $85 on that unit. I'd rather die with $12 in my pocket and the truth in my hand than live 100 years on Castellano's blood money. Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a thin, cold line. "You're being sentimental, Sergeant. Honor is a luxury for the healthy. You're a dying man in a system that has already forgotten you. Think about your legacy." "I am thinking about it," Tom whispered. "I'm thinking about Colonel James Hartford. I'm thinking about a man who died in disgrace because people like you found it pragmatic to let a thief win. I didn't survive a war to sell out a fellow soldier." Sterling stood up, slowly closing his briefcase with a sharp, final click. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was far more dangerous than a shout. "Mr. Castellano has powerful friends, Thomas. Friends who can reach into any room, any apartment, any life. If you won't think about yourself, perhaps you should think about your dog. Duke is a beautiful animal. It would be a tragedy if he were to be found unsuitable for his service role. Or worse. The mention of Duke sent a jolt of ice through Tom's veins. His hand, thin and trembling, clawed at the bedsheet. If you touch him. I don't touch anything, Mr. Kincaid, Sterling said, straightening his tie. I merely advise. You have 24 hours to reconsider. After that, the offer is withdrawn and the consequences, well, they will be yours to manage. Sterling turned and walked out, the door swishing shut behind him. Tom lay in the silence, the ventilator's rhythm now sounding like a countdown. He tried to reach for the call button, but his arm felt like it was made of lead. He had to get word to Baptiste. He had to warn them. But the enemy wasn't waiting for the 24 hours to expire. That night, across the city, the silence of Tom's small, subsidized apartment was shattered. Duke had been staying there under the care of a neighbor, a retired Navy corpsman named Holloway. Holloway had been in the kitchen making coffee when the front door didn't just open, it exploded inward. A shadow moved into the room, a man in dark tactical gear, moving with a silence that suggested high-level training. He wasn't there for the television or the small stash of cash in the drawer. He moved straight for the closet where Tom's military gear was stored. Duke didn't bark. He didn't warn. He launched. The German Shepherd was a blur of black and tan fury, 100 pounds of muscle and teeth driven by a singular primal directive: protect the home. He hit the intruder at chest height, the force of the impact slamming the man against the wall. There was a sickening thud, followed by the sound of tearing fabric and a muffled curse. The intruder was fast. He pulled a collapsible baton and struck out, the heavy metal bar catching Duke across the ribs. The dog let out a sharp yelp but didn't disengage. He clamped his jaws onto the man's forearm, the bone groaning under the pressure. Holloway rushed out of the kitchen, an old service pistol in his hand, but before he could level the weapon, the intruder threw Duke off with a desperate, violent heave and dove through the shattered door. Duke tried to give chase, but as his hind legs hit the floor, he collapsed with a high-pitched, agonizing whimper. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was gone, leaving only a trail of blood and a shredded tactical glove. The police report was a masterclass in apathy. Attempted burglary. No suspect identified. Minimal property damage. They didn't care about the lion rampant pin found near the door. They didn't care that the intruder had ignored the electronics to search for a specific lockbox. When Elena arrived at the apartment 2 hours later, she found Holloway kneeling on the floor, his hands covered in blood as he tried to soothe the shaking dog. Duke's back leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, his breathing fast and shallow. The vet says it's a torn cranial cruciate ligament, Holloway said, his voice cracking with rage. He fought him off, Elena. He saved whatever they were looking for. But he's in bad shape. The surgery, the specialist says it's $3,000. I don't have it. Tom certainly doesn't have it. Elena looked at the dog, the animal that had been the only thing keeping Thomas Kincaid tethered to the world. She reached into her bag and pulled out a credit card. Fix him, she said, her voice hard as diamond. Use the best surgeons. Use whatever it takes. We're in this together now. She didn't tell Tom the full extent of the injury when she visited him the next morning. She told him Duke was resting and that he'd had a minor scuffle with a burglar. But Tom saw the truth in her eyes. He saw the shift from academic curiosity to a soldier's resolve. Get me out of here, Tom whispered. They're coming for the box. Baptiste's farm, take me there. The move was a logistical nightmare, involving a private ambulance and a heavy dose of steroids to keep Tom upright. By evening, he was back in the stone-walled farmhouse, hooked up to a portable oxygen tank, his bed positioned in the center of the command room where he could see the monitors. Duke was there too, his back leg in a heavy cast, sedated but insistent on lying as close to Tom's bed as the tubing would allow. While Tom rested, the rest of the team was in motion. Ray Donovan had disappeared into the city, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, his mind a computer of art history and security protocols. He had spent the night in the shadows across from the Moretti Gallery, a sleek, white-walled monument to stolen culture. Using a high-powered telephoto lens and an infrared filter, Ray had captured images through the gallery's second-story windows during a private cleaning shift. He sat at the oak table at the farm, sliding 3 high-definition prints across to Elena. Look at the brushwork on the corner of the frame, Ray said. Specifically the grain of the wood and the stamp on the underside of the mounting. Elena leaned in with her loupe, her breath catching. It's a perfect match. The Madonna of the Lilies, the Vinci landscape, and the Vatican study. These are the exact paintings photographed in the military crates in 1982. The serial numbers on the authentication certificates in the lockbox matched the hidden marks on these frames. "We have the paintings," Ray said, "but we have a problem." I did a deep dive into the Moretti Gallery's legitimate records. They have a paper trail, forged, obviously, but incredibly sophisticated, showing they purchased these pieces at a private auction in Zurich in 1985. On paper, they are the rightful owners. "The lockbox," Tom said from the bed, his voice weak but clear. "The shipping manifest. They're signed by Castellano. The dates on those manifests predate the Zurich auction. They prove the paintings were already in U.S. military custody 3 years before they allegedly went to auction in Switzerland." "Exactly," Ray nodded. "The manifests are the bridge. Without them, it's just our word against a legitimate auction house. With them, it's a chain of theft that leads directly back to a military transport plane." The final piece of the puzzle arrived in the form of Marcus Webb. The investigative journalist was a man who looked like he'd been chewed up and spit out by a dozen different wars. He had a nervous energy and a cigarette-scarred voice that carried the weight of 1,000 suppressed stories. He spent hours at the farm, poring over the documents, his face growing grimmer with every page. "I've been tracking the money," Webb said, tapping a pen against a spreadsheet of political donations. "Castellano isn't just a donor. He's the foundation of the current administration's defense platform. He's donated $60 million to PACs and campaign funds in the last 5 years alone. He's protected at the highest levels of the DOJ and the Pentagon." Webb looked at the team, his eyes settling on Tom. "I've seen cases like this before. If we leak this to a standard news outlet, the story will be fact-checked into oblivion by Castellano's PR firms before it even hits the air. The evidence will be seized by federal agents for national security reasons, and then it will vanish." Webb leaned forward, the flickering light of the monitors casting long shadows across his face. "Castellano knows you have the manifest, Thomas. He knows that as long as those papers exist, he's one bad day away from a federal prison cell. He's not playing for a settlement anymore. He's playing for a total wipe." "What do we do?" Elena asked, her hand resting on the lockbox. "We need more than a headline," Webb said. "We need a spectacle. We need to catch them with the art in their hands, with the media watching in real time. But we can't do that until we prove the manifests are authentic beyond a shadow of a doubt. If there's even a 1% chance a lawyer can call these forgeries, the whole thing collapses." Webb paused, his gaze moving to the window where the lights of an approaching vehicle were visible in the distance. Far too many lights for a simple visitor. "We're running out of time," Webb whispered. "The political shield is moving. I just got word from a source at the Capitol. A federal warrant has been issued for the recovery of stolen government property at this address. They're not calling it a heist anymore. They're calling you the thieves." As the sound of heavy engines began to rumble at the edge of the property, the lockbox on the table began to emit a low, rhythmic hum, a sound that Tom recognized from his days in the signals corps. It wasn't just a box. It was a beacon. How did Castellano activate a tracking device inside a 40-year-old lockbox, and who was currently leading the federal team that was less than 60 seconds from breaching the front door? The silence of the Baptiste farm was no longer the restorative quiet of the countryside. It had become the heavy, suffocating stillness of a pre-dawn watch before a certain ambush. Inside the stone-walled house, the air was thick with the scent of rubbing alcohol, iron-rich blood, and the electric ozone of high-end monitors. Thomas Kincaid lay in the center of the command room, his world reduced to the flickering green lines of a portable EKG and the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the oxygen concentrator. He could feel the fluid rising in his lungs like a slow-moving tide, a dark, viscous drowning from the inside out. Every breath was a tactical victory, a hard-won expansion of ribs that felt like they were being crushed by a phantom weight. Dr. Aris had come to the farm under the cover of darkness, risking his license and his safety to bring a black bag full of palliative supplies. He stood now by the kitchen table, his face as weathered and gray as the stone walls of the house. He looked at Sarah Baptiste and Elena, his eyes conveying a truth that the clinical charts only hinted at. "The steroid rally is over," Aris whispered, his voice cracking with a weariness that mirrored the dying man's. "The seizure was a systemic warning. The cancer has moved into the lining of the brain, and the primary tumors in the lungs are no longer responding to the baseline blockers. Without the targeted immunotherapy, the $125,000 protocol, Thomas has maybe 2 weeks. If a secondary infection takes hold in his weakened state, it could be days." Elena leaned against the oak table, her knuckles white. And if he gets the treatment? If we find the money right now? Eris looked through the doorway at Tom, then back at Elena. If we start the cycle tonight, he has a fighting chance. It wouldn't be a cure, but it could buy him a year. Maybe more. It would stabilize the neural inflammation and clear the pleural space. But the pharmaceutical company requires payment up front for the private lab synthetic agents. They don't take promises and they don't care about military service. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. $125,000. It was a king's ransom for a man who had spent his last $85 on a storage unit full of ghosts. Inside the room, Tom's eyes flickered open. He had heard them. He had always been a man who could hear a whisper through a brick wall during a firefight. He turned his head slowly toward the doorway. Duke, who hadn't moved from the side of the bed for 18 hours, stood up instantly. The dog's back leg was still encased in a heavy medical wrap, but he leaned his weight against the frame of the bed, his chin resting on Tom's hand. Duke's amber eyes were wide, watchful, and filled with a desperate, singular devotion. Elena. Sarah. Tom's voice was a ghost of itself, a dry rattle that seemed to come from a deep, hollow place. They hurried to his side. Tom's hand, thin and translucent, gripped the bedsheet. He looked at Elena, his gaze burning with a fierce, terminal lucidity. Don't look for the money, Tom managed, each word a monumental effort. The money is a distraction. Castellano wants us focused on survival. He wants us begging for crumbs while he buries the manifests. Thomas, we can't just let you, Elena started, her voice breaking. Listen to me, Tom interrupted, a flash of the old Sergeant First Class sparking in his eyes. This isn't about my life anymore. It was never about my life. It's about the mission. James Hartford. He's been waiting 40 years for someone to finish the job. If I die tomorrow, let it be as a soldier on the line, not a patient in a bed. He coughed, a wet, racking sound that brought a fleck of crimson to his lips. Complete the mission. That's an order. The room went silent, save for the hum of the oxygen. It was the command of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Duke let out a long, low whine, his head pressing harder against Tom's palm. Later that night, Sarah Baptiste and Elena sat in the kitchen, the glow of a single lamp illuminating a pile of bank statements and retirement folders. The air was cold, the wood stove in the corner having burned down to embers. I have $25,000 in my 401k, Elena said, her voice flat, devoid of the professional polish she usually wore. I can liquidate it by morning. It's my entire life savings, the down payment for a house I never bought, the safety net for the family I never had. It's not enough. Sarah Baptiste looked at a faded ledger. I have $15,000 in an emergency fund. It was meant for the farm's taxes and the eventual repair of the barn roof. Combined, we have $40,000. We're $85,000 short of the first cycle. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. $85 had started this. $85,000 was now the barrier to keeping the man who started it alive. We need the settlement, Elena whispered. If we file the restitution case, the court could freeze Castellano's assets. They could order an emergency fund for the whistleblower. The legal system moves at the speed of a glacier, Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the monitors showing the dark perimeter of the farm. Castellano's lawyers will file 100 motions to stay before we even get a hearing date. We don't have months. We have hours. While the women wrestled with the impossible math of survival, Marcus Webb was in the guest room, transformed into a makeshift newsroom. The clatter of his keyboard was the only percussion in the house. He was a man possessed, fueled by black coffee and the raw, jagged energy of the truth. He was weaving together the threads of a 40-year-old tapestry of greed. Ray Donovan stood over him, dropping documents onto the desk like tactical markers. Here are the high-res scans of the Zurich auction forgeries. You can see the pixelation on the museum stamps. They were fabricated using an early digital scanner, something the Army was testing in '84. Elena provided the academic backbone, her voice recorded on Webb's digital device as she gave expert testimony on the stolen masterpieces. The Madonna of the Lilies isn't just a painting, it's a cultural anchor. By keeping it in a private gallery, the Morettis aren't just thieves, they are jailers of history. Sarah Baptiste provided the context of the cover-up, detailing the national security gags and the suspicious transfers of officers who asked too many questions. And from his bed, in the quiet intervals between his coughing fits, Tom provided the soul of the story. He read from Daniel's journal, his voice a haunting narration of a brother's guilt and a hero's fall. By 3 a.m. Webb hit save on a document titled, The Hartford Heist, How a war hero was framed and $200 million in art vanished. It's a scorched earth piece, Webb said, walking into the kitchen, his eyes bloodshot. It names names. Castellano, Moretti, the procurement officers, the senators who took the donations. I have it scheduled to publish on a dozen independent and international mirrors in 48 hours. The clock is officially running. But the clock had a leak. Somewhere in the network of digital pings and secure servers, a flag was raised. A keyword alert on a secure government server triggered a notification in a glass-walled office in the heart of Castellano Defense Systems. Richard Castellano sat behind a desk made of reclaimed battleship teak, watching the notification pulse red on his screen. He was 76 years old, his skin like parchment, his eyes holding the cold, predatory light of a man who had long ago traded his soul for a seat at the table of giants. "They have the manifests," a voice said over the intercom. It was Rick Jr., his son, his voice brittle with panic. "The journalist, Webb, he's got everything. The Zurich papers, the Frankfurt photos. If this goes live, the stock will be at zero by noon. The DOJ won't be able to protect us from the international outcry." Castellano didn't blink. "Then we don't wait for the publication. Call the Gulfstream. Clear a flight plan for Dubai. And tell the board I'm taking an emergency medical leave, effective immediately." "Dad, you can't just run," Rick Jr. protested. "If you flee, it looks like a confession. Let me handle the press. I'll issue a statement. We'll blame it all on a rogue operation from the 80s. We'll say you were a victim of Moretti's fraud." "Sentiment is for the poor, Richard," the elder Castellano said, standing up. "In 48 hours, I will be in a jurisdiction that doesn't recognize art theft as an extraditable offense. You stay here. You play the grieving son who discovered his father's secret and is cooperating fully. Save the company. Save yourself. But let the vet and his dog rot in that farmhouse." As Richard Castellano began his retreat, the machinery of the state began to pivot. The art theft report Ray Donovan had filed days ago, which had been sitting on a dusty desk at the FBI's art crime team, was suddenly pulled to the top of the pile. Not because of justice, but because the name Castellano had triggered a high-level security audit. Ray's phone vibrated on the kitchen table at the farm. He looked at the screen, his face going pale. "It's Special Agent Miller," Ray said, looking at Sarah. "FBI art crime. They want the evidence. They're saying if we don't turn over the manifests in the next 4 hours, they're going to charge us with obstruction and theft of government records." "If we give it to them now," Sarah said, her hand going to the grip of her pistol, "Castellano's friends in the bureau will have it in a shredder before Webb can hit publish." Tom's voice came from the bedroom, stronger now, fueled by the final desperate rally of a man who knew he was out of time. "Give them nothing. We hold the line for 48 hours. We make them come and take it in the light." Duke barked once, a sharp, defiant sound that echoed through the stone house. The dog stood over Tom, his hackles raised, his eyes fixed on the door. He wasn't just a service dog anymore, he was a sentry. Outside, the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, but the shadows in the woods around the Baptiste farm were moving. They weren't the shadows of deer or wind-blown branches. They were the shadows of men in tactical gear, moving with silent, lethal precision. And as Ray looked at the monitor, he saw a black sedan turn into the long gravel driveway. Not the FBI. Not the corporate recovery team. It was a lone car moving slowly, and as it stopped at the gate, the driver stepped out. It was Rick Castellano Jr., and he was holding a white flag. But in his other hand he held a tablet that was broadcasting a live feed from the interior of the Moretti Gallery. Why was the son of the enemy standing at their gate with a white flag? And what horrific sight was currently being broadcast from the gallery that made Elena scream in pure, unadulterated terror? The dawn of the 48th hour didn't break with a whisper. It arrived with the digital equivalent of a saturation bombing. At precisely 6 o'clock, Marcus Webb's finger hovered over the enter key at the Baptiste farm, and with a single definitive click, the world shifted. The headline, "The Hartford Heist: How a War Hero Was Framed and $200 million in Art Vanished," did more than just trend, it detonated. Within 60 minutes, the independent mirrors Webb had established were being hit by millions of concurrent users. The algorithm of public outrage, usually fickle and fleeting, found a rare and righteous bone to gnaw on. By noon, #Justice for Hartford was the most searched phrase on the planet, a digital battle cry for a man who had died in a rented room 40 years too soon. The imagery Webb had included was irrefutable. The grainy Polaroids of masterpieces in olive-drab crates contrasted against high-definition photos of the same paintings hanging in the Moretti Gallery created a visual indictment that no PR firm could spin. The public didn't just see art, they saw the betrayal of a uniform. They saw a decorated colonel, James Hartford, a man who had bled for the flag, being systematically dismantled by a corrupt procurement officer who had traded his honor for a Renaissance oil painting. The reaction from the state was a panicked, chaotic scramble to get on the right side of history. By 1400 hours, the black SUVs surrounding the Baptiste farm had vanished, replaced by a convoy of federal agents whose orders had shifted from recovery to investigation. In a televised display of swift justice intended to distance the administration from its billionaire donor, FBI tactical teams breached the Moretti Gallery. The live news feeds showed the Vatican study and the Madonna of the Lilies being carefully placed into climate-controlled crates, not as stolen property anymore, but as evidence in the greatest criminal conspiracy in military history. The fallout was catastrophic for the Castellano empire. As the New York Stock Exchange opened, Castellano defense systems plummeted. Investors didn't just sell, they fled. By the time the closing bell rang, billions in market cap had evaporated, leaving Richard Castellano a titan of nothing. The man himself didn't wait for the handcuffs. He was intercepted at Teterboro Airport, halfway up the stairs of his private Gulfstream, his passport in hand and a suitcase full of bearer bonds at his feet. The image of the 76-year-old billionaire being pressed against the fuselage of his own jet, charged with theft of government property, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction, became the defining image of the decade's end. 3 weeks later, the theater of war shifted to the sterile, high-ceilinged halls of the federal courthouse. Thomas Kincaid was not in the gallery. He lay in a specialized oncology ward at the University Hospital, the shadows beneath his eyes as dark as the bruises on a soldier's ribs. He was too weak to sit upright, his lungs still fighting a losing battle against the fluid, but his mind was anchored to the tablet Elena had propped up on his bedside table. Duke lay on the bed beside him, his heavy head resting on Tom's lap, his tail giving a single rhythmic thump against the mattress every time Tom's hand moved to scratch behind his ears. The tablet broadcast the restitution hearing in stark high definition. Elena stood at the podium, her voice a calm, unbreakable force as she presented the documents from the lockbox. She didn't just show manifests, she told the story of a family's destruction. She spoke of her father's despair and her grandfather's silent, dignified death. Beside her, Sarah Baptiste testified with the weight of a ranking officer finally delivering a long-overdue after-action report. James Hartford was the most honorable officer I ever served under, Baptiste told the court, her iron-gray hair gleaming under the gallery lights. We didn't just lose a colonel in 1982, we lost the moral compass of the 10th Mountain because we allowed a thief to hold the magnet. Ray Donovan provided the cold, analytical steel, presenting the authentication proof that linked the Moretti collection to the Frankfurt warehouse. Even the Moretti family's high-priced lawyers, recognizing the futility of the fight, began a frantic negotiation. They offered the return of every stolen piece in their global inventory in exchange for reduced charges for the younger generation. Then came the moment Tom had stayed alive to see. Richard Castellano, stripped of his bespoke suits and wearing the orange jumpsuit of a federal detainee, was forced to stand. His shackles rattled, a thin metallic sound that echoed through the silent courtroom. I used my position to orchestrate the theft, Castellano said, his voice a hollow, defeated rasp. Colonel Hartford discovered my operation. He wouldn't take the payout. I framed him to protect myself. I destroyed him because he was better than me. Tom closed his eyes as the words hit him. Mission complete. The judge's ruling was a scorched earth decree. $200 million in restitution. Every stolen work returned to the European museums from which they had been plundered. Richard Castellano was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, a life sentence for a man his age. Most importantly, the court ordered that James Hartford's military record be officially cleared, his dishonorable discharge expunged, and a posthumous commendation for integrity above and beyond the call of duty be issued to his family. The legal settlement was staggering. The Hartford family was awarded $15 million in damages from the seized Castellano assets. European museums, grateful for the recovery of their national treasures, offered an additional $5 million reward. But Elena didn't buy a mansion or a gallery. The day after the ruling, she sat by Tom's hospital bed. The James Hartford Foundation for Veteran Advocacy is officially incorporated as of this morning, Thomas, she said, her eyes wet with tears. And our first board-approved action is the immediate funding of your experimental therapy. $2 million has been allocated for the private lab and the clinical team. They're starting the first infusion in an hour. Tom looked at the ceiling, a single tear tracking through the gray stubble on his cheek. I don't need it, Elena. The mission is done. No, Thomas, she said, leaning in and taking his hand. The mission is just changing. We're naming you the Foundation's Director of Veteran Services. I need someone who knows what it's like to be forgotten by the system to make sure no one else ever is. You have work to do. Tom looked at Duke, who gave a sharp, encouraging huff. A small, defiant spark of life flickered in Tom's chest, the first time he had felt the urge to fight for his own life instead of someone else's. I accept, he whispered. 3 months later. The office was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the soft, rhythmic click of a dog's nails on polished hardwood. Thomas Kincaid sat behind a massive oak desk, the very desk Duke had found in Unit 247, now restored to its original mahogany luster. He wasn't in a wheelchair. He sat in an ergonomic leather chair, a sturdy cane leaning against the side of the desk. The experimental therapy hadn't just stabilized him, it had performed a miracle. The cancer was in a deep, miraculous remission, and the neuroinflammation had cleared enough to restore partial mobility to his legs. Duke lay under the desk, his back leg fully healed, his tail occasionally thumping the floor as he dreamed. He was no longer just a service dog, he was the Foundation's unofficial mascot. Tom looked at the files on his screen. In 3 months, the James Hartford Foundation had secured housing for 50 veterans, provided legal aid for 22 pension disputes, and funded 3 other experimental medical treatments. Tom was no longer a dying man in a subsidized room. He was a man with a schedule, a purpose, and a legacy. His weathered face had filled out, the gauntness replaced by the healthy color of a man who spent his weekends at Baptiste's farm, walking through the woods with his dog. 6 months later. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the city's finest hotel, but the guest list was unlike any other. Generals sat next to homeless veterans. Art historians shared tables with privates. At the head of the room, a military honor guard stood at attention. Elena Hartfordson stood on the stage holding a velvet-lined box. Inside were the restored medals of Colonel James Hartford, the Eagles, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart Tom had found in the trunk. 6 months ago, a man the world had written off decided that justice didn't have an expiration date, Elena told the silent crowd. He showed us that a soldier's duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Tom walked onto the stage. He moved slowly, his gait assisted by a silver-headed cane, but he moved under his own power. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, and for the first time in 14 years, he looked like the sergeant first class he had always been. Duke walked beside him, wearing a formal vest, his head held high as they reached the podium. Tom didn't give a long speech. He told the story of the storage auction. He told the story of the dog who wouldn't stop scratching. He told them that the greatest treasures aren't gold or jewels but the truth. I thought I was spending my last dollars on a gamble, Tom said, his voice resonating through the ballroom. I didn't realize I was buying my life back. The applause was a thunderous, standing ovation that lasted for 5 minutes. Marcus Webb sat in the front row, a copy of his bestseller The Hartford Heist in his lap. Richard Castellano was in a cell in Lewisburg, watching the news on a grainy monitor, while the Moretti Gallery sat empty, its assets ceased to fund the very veterans they had once ignored. The sun was a low, golden orb casting long, peaceful shadows across the manicured grass of the National Military Cemetery. It was quiet here, a profound, respectful silence that felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Thomas Kincaid walked along the row of white marble headstones, the rhythmic thump-tap of his cane and his step the only sound. Duke walked at his side, his nose occasionally brushing Tom's hand. They stopped at a grave that looked newer than the others, the marble bright and clean. The inscription had been changed. It no longer bore the marks of dishonor. It read, Colonel James Hartford, decorated war hero, wrongfully accused, honor restored. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out the original Purple Heart, the one from the trunk. He knelt, his knee joints groaning but holding, and placed the medal on top of the headstone. Mission complete, sir, Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You can rest now. The watch is over. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Elena standing there, holding the hand of a small boy who had her grandfather's eyes. Grandpa, Elena said to the boy, gesturing toward Tom. Meet Thomas. He's named after the man who saved great-grandfather's honor. Tom stood up, his eyes meeting Elena's in a moment of silent, profound connection. He looked at the boy, then at the sprawling field of white markers, and finally at the dog who had refused to let him give up. He took Elena's hand and together they began to walk toward the exit, Duke leading the way. I thought I was dying with nothing to show for my service. Tom's voiceover resonated as the camera pulled back, showing the small group walking toward the sunset, the skyline of the city, and the foundation building, looming in the distance. But Duke wouldn't let me quit. That trunk didn't just hold evidence of a crime. It held my purpose, my final mission. And in completing it, I found something I thought I'd lost forever, my reason to live. Thomas Kincaid was ready to die in silence because he thought the world had moved on. He thought his service and his life didn't matter anymore. If it wasn't for a dog that refused to give up, a hero's name would still be dragged through the dirt. Every day, thousands of veterans like Tom feel that same silence. Don't let this story end here. When you subscribe and like this video, you aren't just hitting a button. You're telling the algorithm that these stories deserve to be heard. Comment, "Honored," below if you believe no soldier should ever be left behind. Silence is how the villains win. Don't be a part of it.